What's good, everyone? This is Arcane Paradox, and boy do we have a treat for you. What if Hogwarts Castle itself rejected Harry's sorting and revealed 56 founder-level wards on him? Hit subscribe and the bell. Let the story begin. Chapter 1, The Castle Speaks. The candles were lying. Harry noticed at first, that particular, trembling quality of candlelight when something nearby is drawing heat away from the air. The 1,000 floating flames above the great hall should have been steady. They'd been steady all through the boat ride across the lake, steady when the doors had swung open and the ceiling had bloomed into a perfect mirror of the clouded sky outside. But now, as Professor McGonagall led the first years in a tight, nervous column between the house tables, the candles nearest the head of the hall were pulling. Bending their flames sideways, slow and deliberate, like compass needles finding north. No one else seemed to notice. They were all looking at the students already seated, the older years craning their necks, whispering, pointing at Harry with the casual cruelty of people who thought pointing wasn't rude if you wanted something badly enough. He caught fragments. That's him, the one with the scar. Yeah, look, smaller than I thought. Ron Weasley, walking just behind Harry's left shoulder, had gone the particular shade of pale that people go when they're trying very hard to look like they're not nervous. Hermione Granger, on Harry's right, was doing the opposite. Her chin was up, her eyes were moving over the hall, cataloging everything, storing it, the way Harry had already come to recognize in the 3 hours he'd known her. Neville Longbottom, somewhere behind them both, had dropped his toad twice on the boat and was almost certainly holding Trevor with both hands now. Harry looked up at the head table. Dumbledore was watching him. Not the way the students were watching him. Not with hunger or curiosity or the particular telescoping awe of people seeing a legend in the flesh. Dumbledore's expression was something older and more careful than that. It was the expression of a man watching a chess piece move across the board and thinking, yes, exactly where I wanted you. Harry looked away first, not because he was intimidated, but because something else had caught his attention. The ceiling. It had shifted. Not dramatically. Not the way storm clouds shift when a front rolls in. This was subtler. The clouds in the enchanted ceiling had stopped moving altogether, which shouldn't have been possible given they were mirroring the actual sky outside, where the wind had been steady and cold all evening. The clouds had gone still, and in the stillness, something else was visible, a faint luminescence moving beneath them, like heat shimmer, but structured. Like writing. Like the castle itself was breathing words into the air above the great hall and waiting to see if anyone was paying attention. Harry was. He didn't know why, exactly. He'd known about magic for exactly 2 months. He had no framework for what he was seeing. He just knew, the way you sometimes know things in your chest before your brain has gotten around to processing them, that whatever was happening in this ceiling had something to do with him. McGonagall stopped the column of first years and set a 3-legged stool in front of the head table with the brisk efficiency of someone who has done a thing so many times it has become automatic. On the stool she placed a hat, ancient, patched, heavily battered, the kind of thing you'd find in a charity shop and leave there. It sat on the stool for a moment with the absolute stillness of an inanimate object. Then it opened a rip near its brim and sang. Harry listened to the song. It was actually quite good, better than he'd expected from a hat, and it seemed genuinely invested in explaining itself, which he appreciated. It talked about the founders, about the 4 houses, about the qualities each valued. It talked about belonging. It talked about how it could see inside your head and find the truest part of you and sort accordingly. The hall applauded. The hat bowed as well as a hat without a neck could bow. McGonagall unrolled a long scroll. When I call your name, you will come forward, sit on the stool, and place the hat on your head. The sorting began. Hannah Abbott, Hufflepuff, to warm cheering from the table on the right. Harry watched but didn't really track it. He was still watching the ceiling. The luminescence had intensified slightly. It was organized into shapes now, concentric rings, nested inside each other, rotating at different speeds, the way certain astronomical diagrams looked. The way, Harry thought distantly, wards might look if you could see them with the naked eye. He had no idea why he thought that. He'd never seen a ward in his life. Hermione Granger went to Gryffindor before the hat had touched her head for more than a second, its brim barely settling against her bushy hair before it shouted its decision like it had been waiting for her specifically. She walked to the red and gold table with a kind of barely suppressed satisfaction that Harry found himself grinning at despite everything. Neville Longbottom sat on the stool and the hat took nearly 4 minutes, the longest sorting so far, long enough that the Great Hall began to get restless and someone near the Slytherin table made a comment that got muffled laughter. Neville's face had gone absolutely still in the way Harry had already identified as Neville's particular brand of endurance, not someone who'd given up, but someone who was used to things taking longer for him than for other people. The hat finally called Gryffindor, and Neville walked to the table with a relief so genuine it was almost painful to watch. More students. Draco Malfoy sat down with the arrogance of someone who considered the sorting a formality and received Slytherin with a smug satisfaction that made half the Slytherin table smirk and the other half look vaguely irritated. Ron Weasley went to Gryffindor with the hat barely on his head, the easiest sort since Hermione. Potter, Harry. The hall went very quiet. Not the polite quiet of an audience paying attention. The sudden, absolute quiet of hundreds of people stopping breathing at the same time. Harry walked to the stool. He was aware of the eyes on him, the weight of them, specific and pressing, like walking through water. He sat down on the stool and reached for the hat, which McGonagall was holding out toward him, and the moment his fingers touched the brim, the candles went out. All of them. Every single floating candle in the Great Hall, extinguished in the same instant, 1,000 small lights just, gone. The enchanted ceiling flared, but not with starlight or cloud. It flared with that luminescent shimmer Harry had been watching all evening, suddenly brilliant, suddenly there, suddenly organized into concentric rings of burning gold script that lit the entire hall with steady, sourceless light. McGonagall's hand jerked back slightly. Harry put the hat on his own head. Inside the hat was darkness and pressure and the distinct sense of something vast paying attention to him. Interesting, said a voice that wasn't a voice, that seemed to come from somewhere between his ears. Very interesting. I've sorted 11,412 students in the last 1,000 years. I have never, the hat stopped. In Harry's experience, things that started sentences with I have never tended to finish them. The hat did not finish. It went silent for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3, long enough that Harry heard someone at the Hufflepuff table whisper to their neighbor with theatrical loudness, "Is it broken?" Then the castle moved. Not a tremor, not the kind of shaking that might come from the Scottish Highlands settling or some subterranean shift in geology. This was purposeful. The stone floor of the Great Hall vibrated at a frequency too low to hear but entirely possible to feel, the way you feel bass through a floor at a concert. Every bench. Every table. Every flagstone. The hat flew off Harry's head. It didn't fall. It flew, sideways and upward in the same motion, sailing away from him and coming to rest on the flagstone floor 15 feet away, where it sat looking, as much as a hat could look, startled. And then the wards came. Harry had no language for it. Later, when he tried to describe it to Hermione, who needed language for everything and would not rest until she had it, he would say it felt like being seen. Not looked at, he'd been looked at his entire life and this was nothing like that. Being seen, all the way through, by something very old that had been waiting a very long time to do exactly this. They appeared on his skin first, lines of golden light, fine as spiderweb and brilliant as sunlight on water, tracing patterns up his hands and forearms, spreading up past his elbows and under his robes and presumably continuing, though he couldn't see that part. They didn't hurt. They pulsed, warm and rhythmic, like a second heartbeat. They moved across his face. He knew this because McGonagall's expression changed from startled to something that had no immediate name, and they moved across the back of his hands in script so small and dense it looked like woven cloth. 56 distinct patterns. He couldn't have counted them himself, he found out the number later, from Hermione, who counted them 3 times to be sure, but you could see them as individual things if you looked, the way you can see individual threads in fabric. Each one different. Each one, somehow, complete. The ceiling's concentric rings aligned. All of them, at once, with an almost audible click of massive magical machinery falling into place, the kind of sound you feel in your molars, in the back of your jaw, right at the edge of perception. Gold and silver and one deep, resonant shade of blue-green that had no good English name all layered together in the ceiling, and the light from above and the light from Harry's skin met somewhere in the middle of the great hall and the entire space went, not dark, not bright, simply, profoundly, settled. Like a house that had been waiting for someone to come home. Nobody spoke. Dumbledore had gone very still at the head table. He was sitting exactly as he had been sitting before, long fingers loosely interlaced on the table in front of him, and his face was composed in the way that faces are composed when the person inside them is working very hard. His eyes, behind their half-moon spectacles, were not twinkling. They had gone the flat, careful blue of deep water. Snape had risen slightly from his chair, not all the way, just enough, an involuntary response he'd clearly caught before it finished. He was looking at Harry with an expression Harry couldn't parse. Not hatred. Not the contemptuous performance he'd received during the boat ride when Harry had accidentally eavesdropped on Snape telling Quirrell that first years ought to be seen only after they'd proven themselves worth seeing. This was something rawer and less deliberate. Like being surprised by your own reflection. Quirrell's stammer, from 3 seats down the head table, was audible even across the great hall. He'd knocked over his goblet. McGonagall hadn't moved. She was looking at Harry with her lips pressed together in the way of someone who has just seen something that completely rearranges their understanding of a situation and is taking the time to do that rearranging properly before they say anything. Of everyone at the head table, her stillness looked most like dignity and least like shock. At the Gryffindor table, Hermione Granger had half risen from the bench and her eyes were moving over Harry with the focused intensity of someone trying to read too many things at once. Her lips were moving slightly, counting. At the same table, Ron Weasley had his mouth fully open. Neville Longbottom was very still, and there was something happening around his hands where they gripped the bench, a faint, responsive flicker of green-gold light, subtle enough that no one in the hall noticed it. Neville himself didn't notice. He was watching Harry. Harry looked down at his hands. The script on his skin was legible, he realized. Not in English, not in any language he recognized, but legible the way music is legible before you learn to read sheet music. He understood the shape of it. He understood that it was old. He understood that it had been waiting. He looked up at Dumbledore. "What," Harry said, in the complete silence of the great hall, "is happening?" His own voice surprised him. It came out level. Curious. Not frightened, and that surprised him most, because he thought he probably should be frightened. But there was nothing in the ward light that felt threatening. What it felt like, honestly, was coming inside after a long time in the cold. Dumbledore said nothing for 2 full seconds, which, from a man Harry had already clocked as someone who considered speechlessness a form of tactical failure, was effectively an admission. Then the headmaster rose from his chair in one smooth motion and said, with perfect calm, "I think we might allow a brief intermission." "An intermission," Percy Weasley said from the Gryffindor prefect row, with the tone of someone who needed the universe to stop doing things that weren't in the rules. 5 minutes, Dumbledore said. Perhaps the house elves might bring some pumpkin juice. This broke something, the spell of collective held breath, the strange gravity of the moment, and the hall erupted. Not in fear. In noise. The specific, chaotic noise of 800 students all trying to tell each other what they'd just seen and compare notes at the same time. The Slytherin table was loudest, which Harry suspected meant they were either most frightened or most interested, and those two things in that crowd were probably the same thing. The Hufflepuff table was generating the most light. 3 separate students had apparently tried to cast diagnostic charms simultaneously and the interference pattern was bouncing off the stone walls in cheerful, useless spirals. McGonagall stepped toward Harry. She stopped just outside arm's reach and looked at him, really looked at him, with an expression that had resolved into something he could read now. Not quite warmth. Not the professional distance she'd shown on the steps of the castle. Something precise and careful and respectful, like an expert encountering a thing they recognize as outside their expertise. "Mr. Potter," she said quietly. "Are you quite well?" Harry turned his hands over again. The ward script was still there, still pulsing. "I think so. Do you know what this is?" "No," McGonagall said, and the honesty of it, the complete uncomplicated directness, made Harry trust her in a way he hadn't fully decided to trust her before. "Not specifically. But the castle does." She paused. "The castle hasn't done anything like this in my 40 years at Hogwarts. Has it done it before? Ever? Once, possibly. Albus would know." She said it without inflection, but something in the way she looked toward the headmaster suggested the sentence had unsaid things attached to it. Dumbledore was making his way down from the head table, moving through the chaos with the unhurried ease of a man accustomed to having the sea part for him. He had recovered his composure entirely, the twinkle was back in his eyes, which somehow made Harry like the previous flat blue stillness better. The twinkle felt like a decision. Students near Dumbledore's path automatically shuffled back to clear it. Dumbledore did not appear to notice this, which Harry suspected meant he was extremely aware of it. He stopped in front of Harry. He looked down at him. Harry was 11 and small for his age and Dumbledore was neither of those things, and he smiled. It was a genuinely kind smile. It was also, Harry noticed, a smile that belonged to someone who was recalculating. "My dear boy," Dumbledore said. His voice had the quality of warm fireplaces and competent authority. "You continue to exceed expectation." "I didn't do anything," Harry said. "No." Dumbledore's eyes moved briefly over the ward patterns on Harry's skin. Something shifted in them, fast, disciplined, gone. "You didn't." He looked up at the enchanted ceiling, where the concentric rings had dimmed slightly but not disappeared. "The castle has spoken, it seems." "What did it say?" "That," Dumbledore said gently, "is what we intend to find out." He rested one hand briefly on Harry's shoulder, a grandfatherly gesture, warm and measured, and then turned back to the hall with the ease of someone who had just settled a minor administrative matter. "Now then," he announced. "Shall we continue?" The 5 remaining first years were sorted in about 90 seconds flat, including a Zabini who went to Slytherin with the hat barely touching his curls, and a Turpin who went to Ravenclaw, and 3 others who Harry did not retain because he was looking at his hands and thinking. The ward light had not faded. He was sitting at the Gryffindor table, somehow, without quite remembering the transition between standing in the middle of the hall and sitting down. McGonagall had guided him there during the intermission chaos, he thought, with the gentle efficiency of someone who had moved confused children to safer locations many times. He was at the Gryffindor table and Hermione Granger had sat down directly across from him and was leaning so far forward over the table that her elbows were practically in the bread basket. "Can I see?" she said immediately. No preamble. "No, are you okay?" though she'd probably decided he was okay given that he was upright and responding to stimuli. Harry held out his hands. Hermione studied them with an intensity that would have been rude if it weren't so clearly driven by pure fascination rather than gawking. She counted under her breath. He heard her reach 56, pause, recount from 30, reach 56 again, and exhale through her nose in a way that suggested she'd been hoping the number would change. "I counted 56 distinct word patterns," she said. "I know," Harry said. "How do you know?" "I just do." He turned his hands over. "I can't read them but I know how many there are." "There are 56. Hermione processed this, which for her took about 1 second. "That's a form of magical awareness. Like proprioception but for the magic itself. That's actually extremely rare, I've read about it, it's associated with very old." She stopped herself. Visibly pulled back. Harry watched her decide to table the textbook and just be present. It seemed to cost her something. "Are you actually all right?" Yeah, he said, and meant it. It's warm, mostly. Like standing next to a fire, but all over. The hat didn't sort you, Ron said from Harry's right. He'd been building to this observation for several minutes, Harry could tell. Ron's face had the particular expression of someone whose brain had been working on a problem and had finally arrived at a question it considered urgent. I've never heard of that happening. 6 brothers, right, and loads of cousins, and not one of them ever mentioned the hat flying off someone's head. It is exceptional, said a voice from above and slightly behind Harry. He turned. Nearly headless Nick was floating just off the left end of the bench with the pleased expression of a ghost who has just witnessed history. He was, now that Harry could see him properly, quite spectacularly nearly headless. A deep groove ran almost entirely around his neck, leaving his head attached by about an inch of translucent ghostly skin. He didn't seem bothered by this. Nearly headless Nick, he introduced himself, to the room in general. Gryffindor's house ghost. And I have been the Gryffindor house ghost for precisely 462 years, during which time I have seen every single sorting in this hall. He paused for emphasis, and I have never, not once, seen the castle activate its founder wards for a student. You know what they are? Hermione demanded. I know of them, Nick said, with the careful distinction of someone who doesn't want to claim expertise they don't have. He drifted slightly closer. The founder wards are, well, they're the original enchantments. The ones the 4 founders wove when they built Hogwarts. Not the protective wards that keep out dark creatures and hostile magic, those get renewed every decade. The original ones. The ones that make the castle what it is. They haven't lit up for a living person in over 1,000 years. What does it mean that they're on me? Harry asked. Nick's expression shifted into something more complicated. I expect several people are going to try to answer that question in the coming days. I'd pay careful attention, he said, with pointed delicacy, to whose answer arrives first, and why. And then the food appeared and the moment broke, because 800 hungry students including a table full of first years who had just experienced an extremely unusual evening were not going to be contemplative about it. The noise level tripled. Ron reached for the chicken with the focused intensity of someone whose purpose had been given clarity. Neville appeared at Harry's left, sitting down carefully, holding Trevor, and looking at Harry with the expression of someone who had something to say and was finding the nerve for it. Harry beat him to it. Your hands were glowing, he said quietly. Back there, when the wards came up. Did you feel anything? Neville went still. He looked down at his own hands, perfectly normal, no ward light. He looked back up at Harry. I didn't notice, he said, very carefully. Then, even more carefully, I felt something. Not like what happened to you. But, adjacent to it. Like hearing a song from the next room. Harry nodded. He filed this away the way he'd learned to file things at the Dursleys, information that mattered, that might be needed later, that was worth more stored carefully than acted on immediately. The feast was excellent, even to someone who hadn't been eating particularly well for the last 2 months of Hogwarts preparation. Harry ate, and talked, and responded to the steady stream of new people who worked up the nerve to lean across the table or the person next to them to say something to him. He was friendly but not performing. He noticed things. He noticed Dumbledore, at the head table, speaking quietly with Snape. Snape's expression as he listened was not the expression of someone receiving new information. It was the expression of someone revising old information against their will. He noticed McGonagall, also at the head table, not eating, making small precise notes on a piece of parchment that she then folded and tucked up her sleeve. He noticed Quirrell, at the far end of the head table, who had stopped spilling things but who had been looking at Harry with a consistent, specific attention that he covered whenever Harry glanced his way by suddenly finding the salt cellar fascinating. Quirrell's purple turban, Harry noted, was giving off a faint smell that drifted even this far across the hall, not the garlic that Ron had mentioned in whispered fraternal wisdom on the boat, but something underneath the garlic. Something chemical and faintly wrong, like copper and storm water. He noticed, at the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy watching him with an expression that had moved through several phases, astonishment, to calculation, to something that looked like the early stages of genuine resentment. Beside Malfoy, a large boy who he'd find out was named Crabbe was looking at Harry with straightforward awe, which Malfoy appeared to find personally offensive. He noticed, most of all, the warts on his skin. Not because they were distracting, they'd settled into a background warmth that felt entirely natural, familiar in a way he had no reference for. But because every so often, one of the 56 patterns would pulse more brightly than the others. And when he tracked what the pulses corresponded to, he found a pattern. They pulsed when he looked at Dumbledore. Not in warning, exactly. Not in the way your skin prickles when something dangerous is nearby. More in the way a compass needle swings when you bring a magnet close to it. Like the wards were paying attention to Dumbledore specifically, and wanted Harry to know they were paying attention. He stored that too. The feast ended with Dumbledore giving his start-of-term notices, the Forbidden Forest, the third-floor corridor, the list of banned items that Percy Weasley nodded through with proprietary satisfaction. Then the school song, which everyone sang to a different tune simultaneously, which Harry found genuinely delightful in a way he hadn't expected. Then the prefects led the first years to their dormitories. Percy walked them toward the moving staircases with the specific energy of someone who has been entrusted with a responsibility and intends everyone to know it. The castle was extraordinary in the dark, portraits muttering and shifting, staircases swinging to new positions, torches flaring in alcoves, the ceiling above certain corridors giving way to glimpses of the enchanted sky. Harry walked through it and felt the castle around him with a clarity that had nothing to do with his eyes or ears. He felt it the way you feel a room full of people even when you can't see them. The castle had a presence. It was old and vast and aware, and it was aware of him specifically, and this didn't frighten him. It felt like arriving somewhere you've been told about your whole life and finding it real. When they reached the Gryffindor Tower, after 3 wrong turns and 1 staircase that Percy insisted shouldn't have moved but had, the fat lady regarded Harry from her portrait frame with an expression that managed to combine the offended dignity of her usual manner with something almost reverent. "You," she said. "You're the one." "Probably," Harry said. "Caput Draconis," Percy said briskly. The fat lady gave him a look that suggested she found him profoundly uninteresting by comparison, and swung open. The common room was round and warm and red and gold, firelight everywhere, comfortable chairs positioned near hearths that seemed to know where you wanted to sit and had adjusted accordingly, or maybe that was just how furniture worked here. Harry didn't know yet. Harry, he was beginning to understand, had a great deal to learn about what was normal and what wasn't. The older Gryffindors were already there, and the room went briefly quiet when Harry came in, the same suspended breath quality as the Great Hall. Harry looked around the room, met whatever eyes were looking at him, and waited for the moment to pass. It did. People are basically curious, he'd found, and being stared at only lasts until the person staring has had long enough to stare and gotten the information they wanted. He found a chair near the fire. Hermione materialized in the chair opposite, which he suspected was not entirely accidental. She had her bag, and she'd already produced a notebook. "You're not going to let this go," he said. "Not even slightly," she agreed. She uncapped a quill. "Tell me everything you felt when it happened. Start from when you touched the hat." Harry told her. He told her accurately and in sequence, including the part where he'd noticed the candles bending before the sorting had even started, and the luminescence in the ceiling, and the hat going silent. Hermione wrote everything down. She had the ability, Harry noticed, to write and maintain eye contact simultaneously, which seemed like either a useful skill or a disturbing one depending on context. "The hat said something," he said. "Started to say something. I've sorted 11,412 students and I have never," and then it went quiet. "It stopped itself," Hermione said. "Or something stopped it." She considered this. "The castle stopped it," she said slowly, working it out as she said it. "If the castle's wards were activating, and if they were specifically recognizing you, then the castle might have overridden the hat." Interrupted the sorting because the sorting wasn't the relevant event. The castle interrupted the hat, Harry said, and something about saying it aloud made it real in a different way. Hogwarts is one of the most heavily enchanted structures in the world, Hermione said, and here she was quoting rather than reasoning, he could hear the textbook in it. Hogwarts, a history says the castle's enchantments are partially sentient, that they respond to magical events and develop preferences over centuries. But I assumed that was metaphorical. She looked at the ward light on Harry's hands. It's not metaphorical. No, Harry said. It's very literal. Nearly headless Nick said the founder wards haven't activated for a living person in over 1,000 years. That means the last time was, she did the arithmetic quickly, right around the time the founders were alive. Which means the last person these wards recognized was probably a founder themselves. The fire crackled. Upstairs, Harry could hear the muffled sounds of the other first-year boys exploring the dormitory and arguing, in Ron's case, about the best bed. Why me? Harry said. Not distressed, just asking. Just wanting the question on the table. I don't know yet, Hermione said. But I intend to find out. She looked up from her notebook. The library opens tomorrow morning. I will be there when it opens. I'll come with you. I was hoping you'd say that. She capped her quill, and for a moment her professional focus softened into something more human. Harry. For what it's worth. What happened tonight, it wasn't something done to you. The way the castle responded, the way it felt, and I know I wasn't the one it was happening to, but you can see things from the outside too, it didn't look like an attack or a curse or anything bad. It looked like a, she searched for the word. A welcome, Harry said. She nodded. Yes. Exactly that. He looked at his hands. The ward script was still there, soft gold in the firelight, 56 patterns breathing slow and steady. The one that had pulsed when he looked at Dumbledore pulsed again now, as if in confirmation of something. He had the distinct and inexplicable sense that the wards had opinions, that they were not passive enchantments but active ones, and that they had been waiting for him to be old enough and present enough to receive what they had to tell him. He was ready. Somewhere in the castle, he could feel, not hear, feel, the deep structural thrum of ancient stone and older magic, the same heartbeat rhythm as the wards on his skin. The castle was awake and paying attention, and the attention was not threatening. It was patient, in the way that very old things that have been waiting a long time are patient. Harry Potter, who was 11 years old, who had grown up in a cupboard, who had been nobody his entire life, sat in the warmth of the Gryffindor common room and felt the 1,000-year-old bones of Hogwarts acknowledge him, and something in his chest settled like a key finding its lock. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow the library. Tomorrow answers. But tonight, the castle knew him, and for the first time he could remember in his entire life, he felt exactly where he was supposed to be. He didn't ask for permission to feel it. He just did. Chapter 2, What the Stones Know. The staff meeting started at midnight. Harry didn't know this because he was invited, he very much wasn't, but because at 11:53, when he was lying awake in the first-year boys' dormitory listening to Ron's already impressive ability to fall asleep mid-sentence, he felt the castle shift. Not physically. The stone didn't shake. But something in the structure of the place changed its orientation the way a sunflower tracks light, a subtle reweighting of attention, a gathering of focus toward a specific point. The ward on his left forearm, one of the longer scripts that curved from his wrist to his elbow in tight, precise lines, pulsed twice in quick succession. Then a different one, near his collarbone, answered it. Harry sat up. He couldn't explain, even to himself, exactly how he understood what the pulses meant. It was like understanding the mood of a room you've just walked into, not words, not logic, just the accumulated information of 1,000 small signals resolving into a coherent impression. The castle was telling him that something was convening. That people were gathering to discuss him. That the discussion was happening in the room behind the stone gargoyle on the 4th floor. He got up, put on his glasses, and found his way to the door of the dormitory by the light of the ward script on his arms. The common room was empty. The fire had burned down to red coals. He stood in front of the portrait hole for a moment and thought about what he was doing, which was, objectively, going to eavesdrop on a staff meeting that he hadn't been told about, in a castle he'd been in for approximately 6 hours. He thought about the ward near his collarbone, which was still pulsing with a particular quality he'd already started associating with the word important. He thought about nearly headless Nick saying, with pointed delicacy, "I'd pay careful attention to whose answer arrives first, and why." He pushed open the portrait hole. The fat lady was asleep, which meant the portrait swung silently. Harry stepped into the corridor, and the castle took him. Not literally, he was still walking, still navigating by his own feet and basic spatial reasoning. But the torches in the corridor adjusted, brightening slightly on his left to indicate a path, dimming on his right. A staircase that should have been swinging away held itself in place as he crossed it. A door he'd never have thought to try swung open at his approach, revealing a shortcut that cut 3 minutes off a route he hadn't consciously been planning to take. He arrived outside the 4th-floor gargoyle in under 4 minutes. Through the stone, through several feet of solid Hogwarts granite, which should have made eavesdropping functionally impossible, he could hear voices. Not clearly. But one of the ward patterns, the one he'd started thinking of as being written in a distinctive, angular script unlike the others, resonated with the stone around him, and the stone, very reluctantly, let the sound through. "Cannot simply wait to see what develops." Snape's voice, clipped and precise. "The ward activation alone is unprecedented. The pattern and number suggest something far beyond a simple magical inheritance. If Voldemort's intelligence network, Severus." Dumbledore's voice, gentle and absolutely immovable as a glacier. A pause. "If certain parties become aware of the extent of the boy's connection to the founder magics, then we shall manage it," Dumbledore said. "As we have managed a great many things. You can't manage this." A woman's voice, not McGonagall's precise alto, but something younger and sharper. Professor Sprout, Harry thought, though he'd only heard her briefly. Albus, the castle refused to sort him. "In 40 years of teaching here, I have never, nor have I, Pomona." "Then you understand that this is not a thing to be managed. This is a thing to be understood." "We are in agreement on that," Dumbledore said pleasantly. "Are we?" McGonagall's voice, unmistakable and cool as a January morning. "Because management and understanding are not the same thing, Albus, and I think several of us at this table know which one you mean." Silence. A longer silence than Dumbledore's silences usually were. "The boy needs stability," Dumbledore said. "He has had a difficult life and he is 11 years old. Whatever the castle has revealed about his inheritance and his connection to the founder magics, he remains a child who must complete his education, who must be prepared for what is coming." "Prepared," McGonagall said. "Not a question. Not an agreement. The ward suggests he has access to protections we don't fully understand," said a dry voice that Harry needed a moment to place. Professor Flitwick, who he'd seen briefly at the Ravenclaw table during the feast, small and cheerful and apparently possessed of a mind like a steel trap when the occasion called for it. "Specifically, I identified at least 3 ward patterns that relate to Ravenclaw's knowledge seals. If they're active and functioning, the boy may have access to, well, to things that were locked away when Rowena died." "What sort of things?" Sprout asked. "Memories," Flitwick said. "Stored knowledge. Possibly the theoretical foundations behind Rowena's most advanced work. The patterns I recognized are what she used to encode her own mind's contents into the castle's structure. She never trusted parchment with her greatest insights." A pause. "If those seals have transferred to a living recipient, the implications for our understanding of Filius." Dumbledore again, the same gentle glacier. "One thing at a time." "One thing at a time," McGonagall said, with a flatness that stripped the phrase of comfort. "Very well. The first thing, then, does Harry Potter know what the wards mean?" He knows something significant happened, Dumbledore said. He has questions. We will, of course, answer them as thoroughly and helpfully as possible. When? When we have determined the full picture. Which will take how long? These things take the time they take, Minerva. A chair scraped. Harry pressed his ear closer to the stone. The angular word pattern on his arm hummed steadily. He will figure it out himself, McGonagall said, and she sounded very certain. He was watching the ceiling before the sorting started. He noticed the candles. He was aware of the ward activation before any of us recognized what we were seeing. That boy is going to walk into the library tomorrow morning and he is going to start pulling books, and you had better be prepared for what happens when he finds answers before we've decided what to tell him. Then perhaps, Snape said, silky and precise, someone should ensure that the relevant texts are not readily accessible. The silence that followed this suggestion had a specific texture. The texture of several people looking at one person and waiting for them to say the thing they were thinking. McGonagall said it. No. Minerva, no, Severus. We are not removing books from an 11-year-old's reach because they might lead him to an understanding of his own magic. That is not something I will agree to. Not tonight, not in the morning, not ever. Another silence. This one shorter. I agree with Minerva, Flitwick said, mildly but firmly. As do I, said Sprout. Snape apparently had nothing to add to this arithmetic. Dumbledore said, of course. Of course, I only meant that context would be valuable, before the boy encounters the raw information. A proper conversation. Tomorrow, I think, I'll speak with Harry directly after breakfast, give him the framework he needs. He doesn't need a framework, McGonagall said. He needs the truth. Harry stepped back from the door. He stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at the word script on the backs of his hands, pulsing slow and steady in the torchlight. The angular pattern had gone quieter, which he interpreted as the meeting moving to topics of less immediate relevance to him. Or possibly it was telling him he'd heard enough. He thought about Dumbledore's voice. Not the content of what he'd said, the texture of it. The way the warmth and the gentleness sat over the calculation like fabric over furniture, smooth and presentable and giving you a very clear impression of the shape underneath if you had learned to pay attention. He turned and walked back to Gryffindor Tower. He didn't sleep, but he was very comfortable lying there not sleeping, thinking. Breakfast was loud and disorganized and Harry was there for all of it. He ate a full plate of eggs. The house elves had strong opinions about eggs, apparently, and drank 2 cups of tea, and the entire time he was reading the word patterns on his arm with the same casual focus he'd have given a book. Some of them, he was starting to understand, had character. The angular one that had conducted sound through stone was observational. A rounder, softer pattern near his right wrist was something he could only describe as protective. A complex, interlocking pattern between his shoulder blades, he couldn't see it but he could feel it clearly, responded when he thought about languages, about meaning, about the gap between words and understanding. Hermione arrived at the table at 7:45 and sat down with her bag already over her shoulder. Library, she said. Library, he agreed, and stood up. Neville appeared at the end of the table, Trevor tucked into his robe pocket, face wearing the expression of someone who has made a decision and arrived before he could unmake it. Can I come? Harry looked at him. The morning light caught the faintest trace of green gold on Neville's hands, there and gone, subtle as breath on glass. Yes, Harry said. The library was a large, high-ceilinged room that smelled like old knowledge and the specific anxiety of students who had not done the reading. Madame Pants, the librarian, was already behind her desk, and she watched the 3 of them enter with the alert attention of a bird of prey observing something moving in the grass. Harry went straight to the card catalogue. He had a method, not something he'd consciously developed, but the ward that responded to intent rather than words, the one Hermione would later identify as a Ravenclaw knowledge seal, was already orienting him. He could feel the relevant sections the same way you feel cold air from an open window. Founder magic, Hermione said, pulling a catalog drawer. Ward theory, specifically preministry period. Hogwarts architectural enchantments. She was muttering, cross-referencing, moving with the efficiency of someone who loved a library the way most people loved a comfortable chair. Inheritance magic, bloodline theory, though I'm skeptical about the blood purity angle, some of these older texts have deeply unpleasant presuppositions. Here, Harry said, pulling 2 books from a shelf without consulting the catalogue. Hermione looked at the spines. The Wards of Hogwarts, A Theoretical History by Armand Beaumont, and Founder Enchantments and the Architecture of Intent by Heloise Vance. She looked at him. How did you know those were there? The ward, he said, and indicated his arm. She opened her mouth, closed it, and accepted this with remarkable efficiency. Right. Sit down, we have a lot of reading to do. They had been reading for 20 minutes when Neville, who had been given the Beaumont and assigned specific chapters, said very quietly, Harry. He was pointing at a passage. Harry leaned over. The text was dense and written in the style of someone who had been taught that academic authority required maximum sentence length. But the relevant section, once you stripped away the scholarly throat-clearing, said something very clear. The founder-level ward bindings, as distinct from the standard protective enchantments renewed by each successive headmaster, are unique in that they possess what Beaumont terms recognition protocols, magical sensitivities designed to activate upon contact with a specific magical signature. These protocols were woven into the castle's structure at its founding and, according to primary sources available to this researcher, have only ever activated on 2 occasions in Hogwarts recorded history. The first was during the castle's construction, when the wards recognized the founders themselves as primary anchor points. The second, though the records are fragmentary, appears to have occurred at some point in the late 10th century, and the surrounding documentation was removed from the Hogwarts archives at an unknown date. Harry read it twice. Then he read it once more. Someone removed the records. Someone removed the records, Hermione confirmed. She'd been reading over his shoulder. Recently, or a long time ago. Unknown date, Neville read, pointing to the relevant phrase. The author doesn't know. Which means the removal was done in a way that obscured when it happened. Harry and Hermione both looked at Neville with the same expression. Neville, registering this, looked slightly self-conscious. I notice things, he said. I'm just usually too worried about being wrong to say them. Don't do that, Harry said simply. Say them. Neville nodded. Something shifted in him, small, internal, but visible if you were paying attention. Hermione had moved on to the Vance text and was now several chapters in, her quill moving in quick decisive strokes. This is more useful, she said. Vance was a ward theorist in the 1800s and she was working from primary founder sources that apparently aren't in general circulation anymore. She describes the ward activation as, listen to this, not a marking of ownership or allegiance, but a recognition of equivalence. The founder magics do not adhere to a person as a brand adheres to cattle. They recognize a person as the castle recognizes its own walls, as constituent, as integral, as belonging to the same unified structure. The 3 of them sat with that for a moment. The castle doesn't think I belong to it, Harry said slowly. It thinks you're part of it, Hermione said. Like, the castle isn't claiming you. It's acknowledging that you were already there. In the structure. Somehow. She frowned at the page. That doesn't entirely make sense yet. It will, Harry said, because the ward near his collarbone had pulsed once, firmly, which he'd already started reading as confirmation. They were still reading when Dumbledore arrived. He came through the library door at 9:43, moving with his characteristic unhurried certainty, and Harry watched him arrive with the same attention he'd given the candles the night before. The headmaster was wearing robes the color of a deep sea and his expression was genial and kind and carefully calibrated. He paused at the edge of the table, looked at the books, looked at the 3 first years surrounding them, and smiled. Early risers, he said approvingly. Morning, Professor, Harry said. I thought we might have a conversation, Dumbledore said, drawing out the chair across from Harry and sitting down with the ease of someone entering a room they own. About last night. I imagine you have questions. Some, Harry said. Dumbledore settled his hands on the table. His eyes moved briefly over the word script on Harry's arms, visible below his rolled-up sleeves, and the look was more controlled than the one in the Great Hall, but Harry caught the same rapid recalibration. Then ask, my boy. I shall do my best. What are the wards? Harry asked. The wards of Hogwarts are among the most complex magical constructions in existence, Dumbledore said, warming to explanation with the ease of a man who enjoys teaching and is very good at it. Woven by the four founders over many years, no, Harry said pleasantly. I know the general answer. I've been reading. He indicated the Vance text without moving it toward Dumbledore. I mean, what specifically are the wards on me? All 56 of them. A small pause. Fractional, but Harry had been waiting for it. 56, Dumbledore said. Yes. Hermione counted twice. I did, Hermione confirmed, without looking up from the Beaumont. Dumbledore looked at Harry steadily. Truthfully, Harry, and I am being truthful with you, I do not know the complete picture yet. What I can tell you is that the founder wards are recognition enchantments. They have identified something in you, some quality or combination of qualities or heritage that, what did you remove from the archive? Harry said. Another pause. This one was longer, and had a different quality. The archive? Dumbledore said. The Hogwarts archive. The records of the second ward activation. The ones the Beaumont mentions were removed at an unknown date. Harry looked at him. Not aggressively. Not accusatorially. Just clearly, with the patience of someone who will wait as long as it takes. You've been headmaster for decades. If someone removed records from this castle's archive, you'd know. Or you'd find out. Or you'd have done it yourself. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. The library was quiet around them. Madame Pants had retreated to a back room, whether from tact or circumstance Harry wasn't sure. When Dumbledore spoke again, the tone was the same, warm, honest-seeming, but something had shifted underneath it. He was no longer constructing an explanation. He was deciding what to share. I removed those records myself, he said. 40 years ago. Why? Because at the time, I believed the knowledge was dangerous. That a full understanding of the founder ward system in the wrong hands could destabilize. He paused. I made a judgment call. I have made many judgment calls over a long career. Some of them, in retrospect, were too cautious. Where are they now? In a secure location. Here in the castle. A beat. Yes. Then I'd like to see them, Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. The twinkle was present but not performing. This was the real version, Harry thought. The one that existed before the performance. It was more complicated than the public version and, perversely, more trustworthy for being complicated. Harry, Dumbledore said, and his voice had dropped the public address register entirely and become simply the voice of a very old man talking to a child. I owe you honesty, and I will give it. What you are carrying, what the castle has identified in you, it is extraordinary. It is also, in ways I don't yet fully understand, connected to forces that have been in motion since before you were born. I want you to have every piece of information that will help you. I also want you to have time. To simply be a first-year student. To have a normal year. I lived under a staircase, Harry said. I've never had a normal year. Dumbledore absorbed this. He was not a man who flinched, but something in him acknowledged the weight of the sentence. The records, Harry said. When can I see them? I will review them myself first, Dumbledore said. And then we will discuss what they contain. I ask for 1 week. Harry looked at him. The ward near his collarbone was pulsing in the quick double rhythm that he decided meant pay attention. Not this is a lie, he wasn't sure the wards did that, exactly, but this matters and not all of it is on the surface. 1 week, Harry said. I'll hold you to that. Dumbledore smiled, and this smile was genuine and a little tired and something in it that might have been relief. I expected nothing less. He rose from the chair, straightened his robes. His eyes moved to Hermione's notes, to Neville's marked-up Beaumont, back to Harry. You have good instincts, he said. And good company. He left. Hermione waited until the library door had fully closed before she said, he took the records himself. 40 years ago, Harry said. And he kept them. He didn't destroy them. No. Harry thought about this. He kept them because some part of him knew they'd be needed eventually. Or, Neville said, from behind the Beaumont, because he couldn't bring himself to destroy something true. Harry and Hermione looked at him again with the same expression as before. You really do notice things, Hermione said. Neville went slightly pink. I've had a lot of practice being quiet, he said. They were packing up their notes when Harry felt it, a pull, specific and directional, from the ward between his shoulder blades. Not the library. Somewhere higher. Somewhere deeper in the castle. He stood still with his bag half buckled and let the sensation orientate him. 4th floor. Not the gargoyle door where the staff meeting had been. Something adjacent to it but different, behind a corridor he'd noticed on the way back from the meeting last night, a length of plain grey stone that had looked exactly like a wall and nothing like a door. Something. Hermione said. The castle wants to show us something. She didn't question this. She slung her bag and stood up. Neville closed the Beaumont carefully, put it back exactly where Harry had found it, correctly, which Madame Pants would appreciate, and fell in behind them. The 4th floor corridor was empty at this time of morning, the upper years still at breakfast and a few other first years who were awake apparently in more obvious parts of the building. Harry walked the length of the greystone corridor slowly, not searching, just being present and letting the ward direct him. It was like following a sound just below the threshold of hearing, you could do it, but only if you stopped thinking too hard about it. He stopped in front of a section of wall that looked like every other section of wall. He put his hand flat against the stone. The ward script on his palm flared, sudden and bright, and the wall simply became a door. Not dramatically. Not with thunder or flourish. The stone lightened in color, the gray shifting to pale gold, and the outline of an archway resolved like a photograph developing, and then the door was simply there, as if it had always been there and had merely been difficult to see. It was. The room beyond was roughly circular, smaller than the library but with the same high ceiling, and the walls were lined not with shelves but with embedded niches, dozens of them, cut directly into the stone, each niche containing a carved object of some kind. Tablets, Harry thought, though they weren't quite flat enough to be tablets. More like the facing pages of a book cut in stone, each one covered in the same script as his ward patterns. Each one glowing faintly, a sustained bioluminescence rather than the pulsing of his own wards. The room smelled like cold air and old lightning. Oh, Hermione said, from behind him. Her voice had stripped itself of everything except raw awe. What is this room? Neville said. Harry walked to the nearest niche. The stone carving was the size of a large book, and the script covered every surface in dense, layered rows. He couldn't read it, not the way you read language, but the ward near his shoulder, the one that responded to knowledge and intent, resonated with it in a way that made his arm feel warm to the shoulder. He put 2 fingers against the carved surface. The script lit up, gold-white, and then something extraordinary happened, the room knew him. He felt it the way he'd felt the castle the night before, not threatening, not passive. Active. Present. He felt the accumulated weight of 1,000 years of knowledge pressing gently against the inside of his mind, not forcing its way in, but offering. Waiting for him to choose. He chose. The warmth rolled up his arm and his shoulder and briefly, just briefly, behind his eyes, and he understood something. Not words, not language, just understanding. He understood that this room was a library in a deeper sense than the room downstairs. This was a library of decisions. Each carved tablet was a record, not of facts or theories but of choices. Moments where the castle's magic had acted autonomously. Moments where the founder enchantments had recognized something or someone and chosen to respond. The record nearest to him was old beyond his ability to fully comprehend. It was the castle's memory of being built. "These are the founder's ward records," he said. Hermione made a sound that was not technically a word but conveyed the comprehensive information of someone completely overwhelmed by academic discovery. "The ones Dumbledore said he took," Neville said. "Or, not exactly those, but, related to them," Harry said. He stepped back from the niche. The records Dumbledore took were physical documents, parchment, written accounts. He could pick those up and carry them out. But the original records are here. In the stone. He looked at the walls. You can't take stone out of Hogwarts. So he knew these existed and still thought he could manage the situation by taking the paper copies, Hermione said, her voice sharpening into the particular frequency of someone who has just caught a flaw in a plan they find frustrating. Because without the context of knowing this room exists, a person who found the paper records wouldn't know what they were looking at. Right. But you found this room in, she checked her watch, 12 minutes after leaving the library. The castle showed me, Harry said. He walked further into the room, and the niches further back were different, younger, or more recently active. Their script was brighter. One near the back wall, when he passed it, flared fully bright, gold and white together, and he stopped. He looked at this tablet for a long time without touching it. The script on it matched the word pattern he'd been calling observational, the angular one that had conducted sound through stone the night before, the one that pulsed at Dumbledore. But it also matched something else. A pattern he'd seen on the Great Hall ceiling, in the moment when all 56 wards had first lit up. A pattern that had appeared there before it appeared on him. "This one is about me," he said. "What?" Neville moved closer. "This record was made last night. It's the castle's record of what happened. Of what it decided." Harry looked at the ward script covering the stone. The castle made a decision last night. A deliberate one. 56 wards. Not random, not residual, not coincidental. A choice. Hermione had her notebook out. She was copying the script as accurately as she could, which was very accurate, and looking between the tablet and Harry's arm. "The patterns match," she confirmed. "The ones on you are directly from this room. Or, more precisely, from whatever this room is an expression of. The castle's will," Harry said. "That's a loaded phrase," Hermione said carefully. "But accurate?" She looked at her notes. She looked at the room. She looked at Harry. "Yes," she said. Frustratingly, yes. The three of them stood in the castle's memory room in the gold light of 1,000 years of accumulated decisions, and Harry felt the ward between his shoulder blades pulse slow and steady, the rhythm that was becoming as familiar as his own heartbeat. Not urgency. Not warning. Just presence. Just, "I am here, and I am paying attention, and so are you, and that is enough for now." On the way out, descending the stairs toward the first defense against the dark arts lesson, Neville walked with his hands slightly away from his sides, the way you walk when something unexpected is happening with your hands and you haven't decided what to do about it yet. The green gold light was there again, steady now, not flickering. Not the comprehensive illumination of Harry's 56 wards. More like a lamp finding its wick. Harry noticed. He didn't say anything yet. Neville would say something when he was ready, and pushing people before they were ready was something Harry had experienced the wrong end of too many times to do to someone else. But when Neville glanced at his own hands and then quickly at Harry and found Harry already looking, Harry just nodded. Neville nodded back. Small, private, sufficient. At the bottom of the staircase, they nearly walked into Snape. Not literally, Snape was facing away from them, speaking quietly to Quirrell in the alcove beside the staircase. But Harry's footstep on the last flagstone was loud enough that Snape turned. The look on Snape's face was not the sneer Harry had been braced for. It was the expression he'd seen at the head table, raw and revised. Close up, Harry could see what it was more precisely now. It was a man who had decided he knew exactly what he was going to be dealing with, and was confronting the information that he'd been wrong. Snape's eyes moved to the word script on Harry's forearms. Back to his face. "Potter," he said. "Morning, Professor," Harry said. A pause. The kind of pause that, from Snape, felt like it had architecture. "You will be in my class this afternoon. 5 o'clock. His voice was stripped of the public performance, the theatrical contempt that Harry had overheard him practicing on Quirrell the previous day. What was left underneath was a voice that was precise and cold and, Harry suspected, honest. "I trust you will have read the Introduction to Potions, a Foundation." "Yes, sir," Harry said. He had, actually, on the train, because the reading list had been genuinely interesting. Something shifted in Snape's expression. Fractional, but Harry was watching. "Good," Snape said, and turned back to Quirrell. Harry, Hermione, and Neville kept walking. "That wasn't what I expected from Snape," Hermione said, when they'd turned the corner. "No," Harry said. "He looked at you like he was trying to figure out who you were," Neville said. "Not who your dad was. You specifically." "I think last night rearranged some things for him," Harry said. "He came here expecting to deal with James Potter's son. He's finding out that's not quite what I am." "What are you, then?" Hermione said, and she was asking it genuinely, the way she'd ask a research question, not rhetorically, not as a challenge. Harry thought about the memory room. About the castle's recognition, its choice. About Dumbledore's careful warmth and McGonagall's honest absence of it and the way the wards pulsed when he looked at each of them. About Neville's quietly lighting hands. "I'm working on that," he said. "But I think the castle's been waiting for me to show up and work on it." They walked out into the morning courtyard, where the Scottish sun had decided to make an effort, and the light caught the word script on Harry's skin and turned it briefly visible to anyone nearby, delicate, luminous, woven over him like fine lace made of gold. A few second years crossing the courtyard stopped and stared. Harry walked through their attention without breaking stride. He had things to do. He had a week before Dumbledore's deadline, a castle full of thousand-year-old answers, and a ward between his shoulder blades that pulsed with the warm, steady insistence of a thing that has been waiting a very long time for someone to be ready. He was ready. Chapter 3, Old Magic, New Rules. The first Transfiguration lesson was supposed to start with the class sitting down, opening their textbooks to Chapter 1, and spending 5 minutes reading the introduction before McGonagall demonstrated the matchstick-to-needle transformation that opened every first-year curriculum. It didn't go that way. Harry sat down, opened his textbook, and read the introduction in approximately 90 seconds, because the ward near his shoulder, the one he'd started privately calling the Ravenclaw ward, the Knowledge Seal, though he hadn't confirmed this with any of the stone tablets yet, had been doing something interesting since breakfast. It was reading ahead of him. Not literally, not in any way he could describe without sounding unstable, but when he opened a textbook, he understood its structure before he'd read it. The index, the progression of chapters, the conceptual architecture of the whole thing, it was just there, the way a room's layout is just there when you walk in and look around. He'd read 3 chapters of the Transfiguration textbook during breakfast, and hadn't noticed he was doing it until Hermione pointed out that he'd been turning pages considerably faster than reading speed. So when McGonagall began her introduction, Harry was already sitting with his wand out and a matchstick in front of him, and the theoretical framework for why the matchstick was a matchstick and not a needle was already resolved in his mind with a clarity that felt, if he was honest, slightly unfair to the people around him who were still on page 1. McGonagall completed her demonstration, a crisp, elegant transformation, the match becoming the needle with the precise economy of someone who has performed this exact motion 10,000 times, and set the students to work. The room filled with the specific sounds of 21st years attempting an act of will on inanimate objects, wand tapping, muttered incantations, frustrated exhales, and from Hermione's direction, a sound of fierce concentration that had its own frequency distinct from everyone else's. Harry looked at the matchstick. He thought about what the textbook had described, the matchstick's essential nature, wood, sulfur compound, a function that had been impressed onto the material by human use and expectation over 200 years of manufacture. The needle's essential nature, steel, single purpose, a different kind of function. Transfiguration wasn't about changing what a thing was. It was about convincing the thing that it had always been the new thing. A conversation, not a command. He raised his wand. He thought needle, not the word, not the image, but the concept, the specific quality of needleness, the fineness and the point and the eye. The matchstick became a needle. Not gradually. Not flickering between states. One thing, then the other, and the transition between them was so smooth it felt like he'd simply corrected a misapprehension. McGonagall was at the front of the room when it happened. She turned at the quality of silence that had developed around Harry's desk, the particular silence of 20 people simultaneously noticing something, and looked at the needle on Harry's desk with an expression that cycled through several states rapidly before settling on controlled assessment. She walked to his desk. She picked up the needle and examined it closely, turning it between two fingers, running a thumb along the shaft and checking the eye. She set it back down. "Perfect," she said. Not with the enthusiastic warmth of someone giving positive reinforcement. With the flat, accurate tone of someone delivering a precise measurement. Complete transformation, no residual matchstick properties, correct gauge and tensile integrity. She looked at Harry. Again. This time, needle back to matchstick. Harry looked at the needle. He reversed the thought, not by thinking about matchsticks but by thinking about the matchstick's specific history, the particular matchstick that had been on his desk, its sulfur head and its wooden shaft and the decades of accumulated matchstick experience behind it. He thought, you were this matchstick. McGonagall's jaw was tight in the way jaws are tight when someone is actively preventing themselves from a visible reaction. "Continue," she said, and moved down the aisle. By the end of the lesson, Harry had transformed the matchstick and back 17 times. Each time was as clean as the first. Around the middle of the lesson, the ward near his collarbone began to pulse in a new rhythm, not urgent, not observational, but something he could only call learning. As if the ward was not just present for what he was doing but participating in it. Processing it. Filing it away in a structure much older and larger than his 11-year-old mind. Hermione, to her considerable credit, had the transformation half complete by the end of the lesson. The matchstick had gone noticeably shinier and more metallic, the point beginning to resolve at one end. She was also, Harry noticed, not looking at his desk. She was competing, in her own way, but she was competing with herself, which was both more useful and more admirable. She caught his eye when the bell rang and he could see her recalculating, but the recalibration had the quality of sharpening, not discouraging. "How did you do it?" she said, without preamble, as they gathered their things. "I thought about what the matchstick knew about itself," Harry said. "And what it could know about itself if it were a needle." She processed this for exactly 2 seconds. "That's intuitive rather than procedural. The textbook's method is procedural, specific wand movements, specific incantation, step by step. The textbook method works," Harry said. "But it's a translation. You don't need the translation if you already speak the language." She stopped walking. "And you just speak the language?" He thought about the ward near his shoulder, the reading ahead quality, the way the matchstick's essential nature had simply been legible to him. "I think I had a tutor," he said. "A very old one." McGonagall caught him as he reached the corridor. Not physically, she materialized in the doorway with the specific timing of a woman who had planned this moment. "Mr. Potter." A word. Harry stepped to the side. The other students filed past, several of them looking back with varying degrees of curiosity. McGonagall waited until the corridor had cleared before she spoke. When she did, she spoke at her normal volume, which was the volume of someone who had never in her life felt the need to whisper to make a point. "What you did in that classroom today is not something I should see from a first-year student," she said. "Not because it's wrong. Because it is so far beyond the standard curriculum that I need to understand what I am working with in order to teach you effectively." "I'll try to go slower," Harry said. "You will absolutely not go slower." She said it crisply, with a firmness that allowed no alternative interpretation. "You will progress at whatever pace your magic dictates, and I will adjust the material accordingly. What I am asking is for honesty. Did you practice over the summer? Do you have prior training that wasn't on your Hogwarts intake form?" "No formal training," Harry said. "I grew up with Muggles. I didn't know I was a wizard until Hagrid came to find me in July." McGonagall absorbed this. The tight jaw expression was back, but Harry was starting to read it as the face she made when information required her to revise structural assumptions. "The ward patterns," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think they're teaching me. Not actively, not like a lecture. More like having a library inside your head that you didn't know was there, and now every time you open a book the relevant sections are already marked." McGonagall was quiet for a moment. Then, without any change in her usual precision, she said, "After classes on Thursday. My office. Bring Miss Granger and Mr. Longbottom if you wish. I would like to understand what you're capable of, and I would like you to have at least one member of staff who is working with that knowledge rather than around it." She paused. "I am not telling you this because I have instructions to report to anyone. I am telling you this because you deserve someone in your corner who is paying proper attention." Harry looked at her. The ward near his collarbone pulsed once, steady and clear. "Thursday," he said. "Thank you, Professor." She nodded, once, and that was that. Defense against the dark arts after lunch was less successful, in the way that anything involving Quirrell was less successful than it should have been. The man stammered through a 40-minute lecture on theoretical defenses against minor hexes that managed to never quite reach the point, and the classroom smelled of garlic and that other thing, that copper and stormwater smell Harry had identified at the feast, strongly enough that 3 students in the front row were visibly distracted by it. Harry sat in the middle of the room and watched Quirrell the way he'd watched the candles the night of the sorting. Not obviously. Just steadily. The angular ward on his forearm, the observational one, was more active in this classroom than it had been anywhere else in the castle. Not pulsing. Vibrating. A sustained, low hum that was different in quality from any of the other ward responses he'd catalogued so far. He'd been sorting the wards by their rhythms. The Ravenclaw knowledge seal read ahead and filed information. The protective ward near his wrist was quiet and warm. The Slytherin ward, he was fairly confident now about which one it was, responded specifically to attempts at mental intrusion or compulsion, and it had flickered twice during Quirrell's lecture when the professor's gaze had swept the room in a particular way. Not a natural gaze. The gaze of someone looking for something specific. After the third pass of that gaze, the Slytherin ward didn't flicker. It locked. A sensation like a door closing and bolting, smooth and absolute, and then Harry was simply opaque to whatever Quirrell was looking for. He could feel the looking, a mild external pressure, unfocused and searching, moving across the classroom and sliding off him like water off glass. Quirrell's stutter intensified slightly, and he looked down at his notes. Harry made a note in the margin of his defense textbook, Q, looking for something in students' minds. Ward blocked it. Felt like probing, not observation. Why? He added, smell. Not garlic. He added, turban. He left it at that. Potions was at 5, in the dungeons, and the dungeon classroom was cold in the specific way of rooms that have been underground for 1,000 years and have decided this is simply their nature. The cold didn't bother Harry particularly. He'd spent winters in a cupboard with a broken heating vent. Snape's classroom entrance was theatrical in a way that seemed entirely natural to the man. He didn't perform it, he simply had the quality of filling whatever space he walked into with the weight of his attention. The class sat down a little straighter when he entered. Ron Weasley, on Harry's left, looked like he'd swallowed something uncomfortable. Snape stood at the front of the room for a moment, looking at the class with the expression of a man who has thought carefully about what he intends to say and intends to say it regardless of audience response. "There will be no foolish wand-waving in this class," he began. Harry listened. The speech was, taken purely on its merits, excellent, concise, specific, genuinely interesting in its description of what potions could accomplish. Snape had a gift for language that was completely at odds with his manner. He described Veritaserum and Polyjuice Potion with the precise economy of someone who had thought about these things long and deeply and had decided that accurate language was the only language worth using. Then Snape's eyes found Harry Potter. He said it without announcement, without theatrical build-up. "What is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane?" "They're the same plant," Harry said. "Also called aconite. The name depends on regional tradition. Wolfsbane is the Northern European term, monkshood references the flower shape, aconite is the Latin botanical name. It's extremely toxic in raw form and produces a significant magical response in potion-based work because the plant grew in proximity to early werewolf settlements and developed magical properties in response." The classroom was very quiet. Snape looked at him. Not with the manufactured contempt that Harry had been prepared for. With the expression of a man encountering information he needs to process before he responds. "The last part," Snape said carefully. "About the plant developing properties in proximity to werewolves. Where did you read that?" "I didn't," Harry said. "I worked it out this morning from the first chapter of the potions text. The growth conditions listed for high-potency aconite all correspond to areas with historically dense werewolf populations. If you cross-reference the magical properties of the plant with the basic theory of environmental magical absorption, Chapter 3 of Theoretical Potions, the hypothesis follows fairly directly." Snape was quiet for 4 full seconds. Harry could hear Ron breathing beside him. "That is," Snape said, "not entirely incorrect." He paused. "That hypothesis was first formally proposed by Hector Dagworth Granger in 1847. You arrived at it independently in one morning." "The ward helps," Harry said. "Yes," Snape said, and his voice had a flatness that was not hostile, just private. "I imagine it does." He moved to the front board. "Potions preparation. Boil cure potion. Instructions on the board. You have the period." He did not ask Harry another question during the class. But Harry was aware, with the peripheral awareness that had become as natural as breathing, that Snape watched him throughout, not the constant surveillance of a suspicious authority but the attention of a man actively revising his model of a situation in real time. Harry made a perfect boil-cure potion. Hermione made a slightly imperfect one, a shade too much bitterroot on the 3rd edition, and spent the last 10 minutes of class looking at the slight error in her cauldron with an expression of severe personal disappointment. Neville knocked his cauldron over at the 45-minute mark, and Snape appeared at his elbow so quickly that Harry suspected he'd been anticipating it, and corrected the angle of Neville's stirring motion without comment. Neville, Harry noticed, stirred correctly after that. Snape noticed too, because he didn't return to that part of the room for the rest of the lesson, which was, Harry thought, its own form of acknowledgement. The Ministry Observer arrived on Thursday morning. Harry knew about it before the announcement, because the ward near his collarbone had been pulsing with the double-quick rhythm, "Pay attention," since before breakfast, and when he came down to the Great Hall and found McGonagall's expression had acquired a new quality, sharp and contained as a kept knife, he knew something had shifted in the landscape. A woman was sitting at the head table in the spare seat that usually held substitutes and visiting examiners. She was wearing robes in ministry purple, a color that seemed to have been chosen for maximum visibility. She was short and broad-shouldered and wore her gray-blonde hair in a severe bun, and she was smiling with the persistent warmth of someone who had learned that a smile was a useful tool and had never updated this belief with field data. "Ministry Observer," Hermione said, when Harry sat down. She'd already gathered context, she always had. Her name is Dolores Umbridge. She's a senior undersecretary in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, which means she has broad authority to observe and report on matters of what she'd call magical safety. She arrived this morning. McGonagall didn't look pleased. McGonagall looks pleased about roughly 3 things, Harry said. Accurate transfiguration, properly brewed tea, and students who read before class, Neville supplied. Harry and Hermione both turned to look at him. He shrugged, slightly pink. "You've been spending too much time with us," Hermione said, but she sounded pleased. Umbridge was watching Harry. Not subtly, she'd been watching him since he sat down, with the focused, cataloging attention of someone who has been sent here specifically for this. Her smile did not waver. The smile, Harry thought, was not a response to anything. It was a policy. He looked at his eggs. The ward near his wrist, the protective one, warm and quiet, had gone from its background hum to something more active. Not aggressive. Just awake. At mid-morning, between herbology and a free period, Umbridge intercepted him in the corridor outside the greenhouses. She appeared from a side passage with the smooth efficiency of someone who had positioned herself carefully, and Harry stopped walking and let her come to him. "Harry Potter," she said. Her voice was high and sweet, with a deliberate softness that seemed carefully calibrated to communicate warmth and in fact communicated the memory of warmth, the way a photograph of a fire communicates heat. "I've so been looking forward to meeting you. I'm Dolores Umbridge, from the Ministry." "I know," Harry said. "I'm here simply to observe, just a routine visit. We do check in with Hogwarts every few years, but I must say, what I saw at the sorting ceremony was quite remarkable." She tilted her head. The smile didn't move. "The Ministry is very interested in your well-being. Given what you represent to our community, what do I represent?" Harry said. A fractional pause. "Hope, dear boy. You are, after all, the reason we are all safe." "I was 1 year old," Harry said. "I didn't do anything. My mother did something. There's a difference." The smile adjusted slightly, like a photograph being straightened on a wall. "Of course. Your mother was very brave." She let a pause develop, and then filled it with the ease of someone who has rehearsed the conversation. "The wards that appeared at your sorting, the Ministry's Magical Assessment Division would very much like to examine them. A simple diagnostic procedure, quite painless, just to ensure that you are protected and that there are no unintended consequences from such a powerful magical event." "No," Harry said. The smile held, but the warmth behind it, the performance of warmth, flickered. "I beg your pardon." "No," Harry said again. "I don't consent to a Ministry examination of my magic. I'm 11, which means I can't give binding legal consent anyway, and my magical guardian, which is Dumbledore, as headmaster, hasn't authorized it. So no." Umbridge's smile disappeared entirely for just a moment, a real expression underneath, and it was not pleasant. Then the smile came back, recalibrated slightly. "Of course. This would go through proper channels. I just thought, informally, informal requests for access to a minor's magical signature are still requests," Harry said pleasantly. "The answer is still no. Perhaps we could involve Professor Dumbledore," she said, and her voice had picked up an edge. "You could," Harry said. "Though I think you'll find he'll want to review the Ministry's legal authority for the request first. He's thorough that way." He smiled, and his smile was genuine and warm and not a policy. "Was there anything else, Professor Umbridge? I have a free period I'd like to use productively." He walked away. The ward near his wrist pulsed once, a firm satisfied rhythm, and went back to its background warmth. Behind him, he didn't hear footsteps. He heard silence, the silence of someone standing still in a corridor, reassessing. McGonagall's office on Thursday afternoon smelled like tea, old parchment, and the particular dry scent of Transfiguration textbooks. The room had been her office for 40 years and it knew it, comfortable and cluttered and precise in the way of spaces shaped by long habitation. There were cat figurines on 3 surfaces, which Harry did not comment on, and a complicated piece of transfiguration theory on the blackboard behind her desk, which he read in the time it took to sit down and found genuinely interesting. McGonagall poured tea before anything else. This seemed to be a non-negotiable part of her process. "Right," she said, sitting down across the desk. "Tell me what you know." Harry told her. Not everything, not the midnight eavesdrop outside the 4th-floor gargoyle door, but the library research, the memory room, the nature of the wards as he was beginning to understand them. Hermione supplemented with her notes at precise intervals. Neville added 3 observations that were each quietly essential: that the wards seemed to respond to intent rather than action, that the memory room's records were organized chronologically rather than by founder, and that the green gold light on his own hands had been steadily present since the previous morning. McGonagall listened without interrupting. She was very good at listening, the kind of listening that is not waiting to speak but actually receiving information. "The green gold," she said, when Neville mentioned it. "Show me." Neville put his hands on the desk. He looked at them with the concentration of someone trying to call up something they're not sure is reliable, and after a moment, the light was there, steady, warm, botanical in its quality, something old and deeply patient. McGonagall studied his hands for a long moment. "Hufflepuff," she said. "Professor?" Neville said. "The quality of that light. The color and the character of it. Earth magic, loyalty anchors, those are Hufflepuff's foundational ward signatures." She looked at Harry. "The castle didn't activate for Mr. Longbottom the way it activated for you. But it responded. His own magic responded to yours, and what's emerging is consistent with a Hufflepuff lineage ward recognition, dormant until last Saturday." "The castle woke him up," Harry said. "It woke something," McGonagall said. She sat back. "I want to address the Umbridge situation." Harry had expected this. "She doesn't have the authority she implied she has," McGonagall said. "The Ministry cannot examine a student's magic without parental or guardian consent and a formal Wisengamot order. She knows this. She was testing your knowledge of your own rights." "I know," Harry said. "She'll report that you refused the informal request. The Ministry will respond with either a formal request through proper channels, which Albus will manage, or with something less straightforward." She paused. "Umbridge is not operating independently. She was sent here because someone in the Ministry has decided they need to understand what you are before you understand it yourself." "Fudge," Hermione said. "Cornelius Fudge is a man who is frightened of things he doesn't understand," McGonagall said, with the careful precision of someone making a characterization they intend to be accurate rather than cutting. "He will have sent someone he trusts to gather information quietly. The problem is that Umbridge's version of quietly is other people's version of loudly." Harry thought about this. He thought about Dumbledore's 1-week deadline on the archive records. They were 3 days in. He thought about the memory room and the tablet that recorded last Saturday's events. He thought about the ward near his collarbone, which had been pulsing with its pay-attention rhythm since Umbridge's arrival and had not stopped. "I want to see those records before the week is up," he said. McGonagall looked at him. "I cannot compel the headmaster to share them ahead of schedule." "I know," Harry said. "I'm not asking you to." He looked at his tea. "I'm saying I intend to have that conversation with him myself. I just wanted you to know." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I had a student once," she said. "Took my Transfiguration Newt course, never did anything exactly as I specified, always found a more direct route. I spent the first term frustrated and the second term astonished and the third term just trying to keep up." She looked at Harry with something that was not quite warmth but was its close relative. "I am adjusting my expectations accordingly." Harry grinned. He couldn't help it. "Right," McGonagall said crisply. "Now. You transformed a matchstick to a needle and back in the first 60 seconds of my class. I want to know the upper limit of your current transfiguration ability, because I intend to have appropriate material ready for you by next week. Miss Granger, Mr. Longbottom, I'll assess you individually as well. There is no reason any of you should be bored in my classroom. She produced 3 matchboxes from her desk drawer, and the lesson, real lesson, not the classroom performance, began. Harry worked through the matchstick and up. Larger objects, a book, a glass paperweight, the edge of her desk, revealed something interesting. His accuracy scaled with his understanding of the object's nature, not his effort. The desk was harder not because it was bigger but because it had more history, more layered human use and purpose. He got the corner to shift grain and composition before the period ended, which made McGonagall press her lips together in a way that was, definitively, suppressed satisfaction. Walking back toward Gryffindor Tower afterward, in the long corridor where the late afternoon light came through the west-facing windows and hit the stone floor in warm diagonals, Harry stopped. Dumbledore was at the far end of the corridor. He hadn't appeared, he'd simply been there, walking toward them, the way Dumbledore seemed to simply always be exactly where the conversation needed him to be. "Harry," he said. "I was hoping I'd find you." The tone was genuine. Harry calibrated against it. "You wanted to talk. Walk with me." It was an invitation, not a direction. Harry fell into step beside him. Hermione and Neville, reading the moment with the social intelligence they'd each developed in their own ways, dropped back. They walked in silence for a moment. The castle settled around them in its evening mode, torches brightening, staircases locking into positions that would hold through dinner. "Umbridge," Dumbledore said. "I told her no," Harry said. "She told me." A pause. "She framed it as uncooperative. I told her you were exercising entirely legitimate rights and that any formal request would be reviewed by my office and the school's legal counsel before it proceeded." His voice was measured. "The ministry will push. Cornelius is concerned. By me. By what you represent. By what he doesn't understand." Dumbledore paused at a window, looking out over the grounds where the last light was catching the black lake surface. "He is not a bad man, Cornelius. He is a small one. Small men in large positions find powerful things frightening." "The archive records," Harry said. Dumbledore turned from the window. He looked at Harry for a long moment. The hall was empty around them, the evening quiet pressing in, and the headmaster's expression had that quality again, the real version, before the performance, more complicated and more honest. "You weren't going to wait the full week," Dumbledore said. "I was going to ask politely first," Harry said. "I'm asking politely now. There's a ministry official in this castle who was sent here specifically to access information about my magic before I can access it myself. That changes the timeline." "Yes," Dumbledore said. "It does." He was quiet for a moment. "Tomorrow morning, before breakfast. My office. Come alone." Harry thought about this. "Can Hermione come?" "Miss Granger. She's already read 2/3 of the relevant academic literature and taken comprehensive notes. Having her there saves time." Something crossed Dumbledore's face that was, despite everything, genuine amusement. "Miss Granger may come," he said. 8 o'clock. Harry nodded. He turned to go. "Harry." Dumbledore's voice stopped him. "I want you to know, everything I have done, including the things you'll read about in those records tomorrow, was done in the belief that I was protecting something important." A pause. "I recognize that belief and accuracy are not the same thing." Harry turned back. He looked at Dumbledore, this old, extraordinary, genuinely well-intentioned and deeply complicated man who had decided, years ago, that the best way to protect the boy who lived was to keep him small until the moment he was needed. Who had removed records from an archive because the knowledge in them might destabilize a plan he'd built with great care and great love and great blindness. "I know," Harry said. "I believe you believe that." He walked back to where Hermione and Neville were waiting, and the ward near his collarbone pulsed slow and steady, its rhythm an old word in a language he was only just beginning to read. Not forgiveness. Not judgment. Something older and more useful than either. Clarity. That night, in the Gryffindor common room, while Ron was loudly losing a chess match to himself and the fire was burning down toward coals and the rest of the tower was slowly quieting, Harry sat with Hermione and Neville and they did something that felt entirely natural and entirely necessary. They made a plan. Not a defensive plan. Not a stay safe and wait for adults to figure it out plan. The ward on his forearm, the observational one, had been cataloging information for 4 days and Harry trusted its accounting. He knew that Umbridge would escalate. He knew that the Ministry's interest in him was not benign. He knew that Dumbledore, however genuinely he believed in Harry's well-being, had spent decades treating protection and control as synonyms. He knew that Quirrell was looking for something in students' minds during defense class and sliding off Harry's Slytherin ward when he found it, and that the smell in that classroom was wrong in a way that had nothing to do with garlic. He knew, most centrally, that the answer to all of it was in those archive records, the ones Dumbledore had taken and kept, the ones that documented the second ward activation, the ones that would explain what the castle had chosen him to carry and why. Tomorrow he would have them. When we read them, Hermione said, when, not if, she'd been updated, what are we actually looking for? Why 56 specifically, Harry said. What the second activation was. Who the last person was that the castle recognized this way. He paused. And what they did with it. History, Neville said. Yes. So we don't repeat the mistakes. Harry looked at him. The green gold light on Neville's hands was steady in the firelight, warm as an ember. Exactly that, Harry said. Outside, the Scottish Highlands were dark and vast and the wind was picking up off the lake, and somewhere in the deep structure of Hogwarts Castle, in the bedrock and the brickwork and the ancient wards woven by 4 extraordinary people who had understood that magic was a living thing, something turned in its long sleep and settled deeper into attention. The castle was ready. Its heir was almost ready too. Chapter 4. The weight of inheritance. Dumbledore's office was at the top of a spiral staircase behind a stone gargoyle that moved aside for Harry before he'd said the password, which Dumbledore had sent via McGonagall the previous evening on a folded piece of parchment. The gargoyle's movement was smooth and immediate, and Harry had the distinct impression it wasn't responding to the password at all. The office itself was extraordinary in the way of rooms that have been occupied by one extraordinary person for a very long time and have gradually reorganized themselves around their inhabitants' particular density of personality. Instruments Harry had no names for yet rotated on spindle-legged tables, emitting soft silver smoke in shapes that dissolved before they fully resolved. Portraits of previous headmasters and headmistresses lined the walls, some asleep, some watching with the particular quality of attention that portraits in magical buildings had, present enough to be aware, constrained enough that awareness was all they could offer. Fawkes was on his perch near the window, a phoenix of impossible redness against the grey Scottish morning, and he turned his head when Harry entered and regarded him with the patient golden intelligence of something that has watched the world cycle through iterations Harry couldn't count. Then Fawkes made a sound, not the full burning bright song that phoenixes were supposed to make, but something quieter and more personal, a single note that landed in Harry's chest and stayed there like a warm coal. The ward near his collarbone answered it. A slow, full pulse, almost a greeting. Fawkes ruffled his feathers with what looked very much like satisfaction. Dumbledore was standing at his desk rather than sitting behind it, which Harry registered as a choice, a deliberate removal of the barrier of the desk between them. On the desk's surface were 2 items, a leather folder, old and dark, the leather cracked at the corners and the edges worn soft with handling. And a pensieve, a shallow stone basin filled with silver memory substance that moved like water with opinions, slow and purposeful. Hermione came in just behind Harry, took in the pensieve immediately, and made the sound she made when she encountered something she'd read about but never seen. Miss Granger, Dumbledore said. Thank you for coming. He gestured to the chairs arranged in front of the desk, 3 of them, Harry noticed, and they sat. 3 chairs, Harry said. I also sent a note to Mr. Longbottom, Dumbledore said. As if on cue, Neville appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath, Trevor secured in his front pocket. He looked around the office and went very still for a moment in the way of someone who is used to rooms like this being places where things happen to him rather than for him. Harry caught his eye and tilted his head toward the third chair. Neville sat down. Dumbledore did not sit. He rested his hands on the desk on either side of the leather folder, and he looked at the three of them with an expression that Harry had not seen from him yet, stripped of warmth performance and calculation performance and the elaborate public face. Just a very old man, standing in his office on an early Friday morning, looking at an 11-year-old who had backed him into a necessary corner. "I'm going to tell you several things," Dumbledore said. "Some of them will be difficult. Some of them will make you angry with me. I ask that you let me finish before you respond." He paused. "That is a request, not a direction. You are under no obligation to comply." "We'll listen," Harry said. Dumbledore opened the leather folder. Inside were pages of parchment, old, the older ones fragile and the color of late autumn leaves, the newer ones merely aged. They were covered in different hands, cramped scholarly scripts, bold architectural notations, 2 pages that appeared to be in a language none of them recognized, and at the back, several pages in Dumbledore's own precise copperplate. "The second ward activation," Dumbledore began, "occurred in 991 years ago, which is to say, approximately, at the time of Hogwarts' founding. The founders themselves. Not a student." He turned a page. "What the academic literature does not record, because I removed the evidence of it, is that the castle's recognition protocols were activated a second time. Not during the founding. 40 years later, when the founders were elderly and one of them, Helga Hufflepuff, was dying. The room was very quiet. Hufflepuff was the last of the 4 to die," Dumbledore said. "Gryffindor had gone first, then Ravenclaw, then Slytherin, though Slytherin's departure from Hogwarts preceded his death by decades, and the record of his end is incomplete. When Hufflepuff was dying, she called all 4 founders' magical signatures together, her own, and the residual imprints that Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin had left in the castle's fabric. She wove them together and she bound them to a single point." He looked at Harry. She was looking for continuity. She understood that the castle would outlast any individual, any lineage, any generation. She wanted to ensure that the founder magics would not simply dissipate or dilute over centuries. So she encoded them into the ward activation protocol, and she set a condition. "What condition?" Hermione said. "That the full activation, all 4 signatures simultaneously, which is what we saw at the sorting, would only occur when someone arrived who carried a genuine magical inheritance from all 4 founders. Not blood," he said, and this was directed at Harry. "Specifically not blood descent. Magical inheritance. The distinction is critical. Blood can be diluted, manipulated, faked. Magical inheritance is earned through generations of meaningful connection, teachers and students, mentors and apprentices, the transmission of genuine understanding rather than mere genetics." Harry held this for a moment. Then he said, "The founders taught people who taught people who taught people." "For 1,000 years, Dumbledore confirmed. "Every magical person alive today in Britain has some trace of founder magic in their inheritance, if you go back far enough. But the traces are just that, traces. Fragments. What the castle activated in you is not fragments." He closed the folder gently. 56 ward patterns. 12 of Gryffindors, 14 of Ravenclaws, 11 of Hufflepuffs, 10 of Slytherins, 9 belonging to the castle itself. The complete inheritance. Which means that somewhere in your magical lineage, Harry, across the 1,000 years between the founders and you, every single one of those lines of transmission remained intact and came together in one person. "In me," Harry said. "In you." Dumbledore's voice was very even. "Helga Hufflepuff designed the protocol to find exactly this, and she designed it to be patient. She understood it might take 500 years. It took 1,000. Neville leaned forward. But Harry's ward activation affected me, he said. Not the same way. But it did. Dumbledore looked at him with what appeared to be genuine respect. Yes, Mr. Longbottom. It did. The Hufflepuff ward signatures, when they activated in Harry, resonated with your own magical core. He paused. Your magic has been suppressed. This is not your fault. You received a significant shock at the age of 8, my grands told everyone, Neville said, flatly. Not upset. Just factual, the tone of someone who has had a piece of their history discussed by others often enough that they've stopped flinching at it. What happened to you damaged your natural connection to certain kinds of earth magic and loyalty anchoring that you'd already begun to develop. The Hufflepuff wards didn't create something new in you. They recognized something that had always been there and had been cut off from its source. Dumbledore's voice was gentle on this. Genuinely gentle. Your magic is not broken, Neville. It has been waiting for the correct resonance to reconnect. Neville said nothing. He looked at his hands, where the green-gold light was a steady, undeniable fact in the morning air. Then he looked up at Harry, and there was something in that look that Harry thought would take both of them some time to find words for. Harry turned back to Dumbledore. What does Voldemort have to do with any of this? The portraits around the room stirred. Several of the sleeping ones woke abruptly. The name had an effect on a room full of magical memory that a name didn't have in ordinary spaces. Fawkes made a low, sustained sound and his fire brightness intensified slightly. Everything and nothing, Dumbledore said. He moved to the pensieve. What I am about to show you is a memory. Specifically, a memory extracted from the castle's own ward structure, which I believe you already know is possible, having found the memory room on your second day here. He said it without reproach. Harry didn't apologize. This memory belongs to Salazar Slytherin. Hermione's quill, which she had produced from somewhere and had been moving in quick strokes, stopped. Not a copy, Dumbledore said. Not a recreation. Slytherin encoded his actual memory into the castle's foundations, the way Ravenclaw encoded her knowledge into the knowledge seals. He did this in the years after his departure from Hogwarts, when he was alone and aging and, I believe, doing something he hadn't done very often in his life. He looked at the pensieve. Reconsidering. Reconsidering what? Harry asked. Will you see for yourself? Harry stood up. He walked to the pensieve and looked into it. The silver substance roiled slowly, and in it he could see shapes, not images exactly, more like the memory of images, the impression of a time and place that had been distilled into essence and held for 1,000 years. He looked back at Hermione. You should go in, she said immediately. I'll stay out here and take notes on what you tell us afterward. Someone needs to be outside the memory with their feet on the ground. Harry looked at Neville. I'll go with you, Neville said. Harry didn't say are you sure, because Neville was sure, and asking him whether he was sure was exactly the kind of thing that had been done to Neville his entire life by people who meant well and didn't understand that certainty does not need to be interrogated to be valid. They went in together. The pensieve swallowed them and the office dissolved. They came up in winter. Not Hogwarts in winter, somewhere else, older, a room with stone walls that were rougher than Hogwarts finished granite, more like a fortified house than a castle, with narrow windows set deep in the walls and a fire in a central hearth that had clearly been burning for a long time. The air was cold despite the fire, a deep structural cold, and the light was gray and diffused. A man was sitting at a table near the fire. He was old, not Dumbledore old, not the theatrical ancient that popular imagination had decided Slytherin must have been, but genuinely aged in the way of people who have been physically powerful most of their lives and are only now encountering the body's honest accounting. His hair had been black and was mostly white. His face was lined in the particular pattern of someone who has spent decades in both outdoor weather and difficult thought. His eyes were dark and sharp and, in this memory, alone with himself in a way that changed their quality. He was not what Harry had expected. He was not a villain. He was just a man, very old, in a cold room, writing something with the focused unhurried attention of a person who knows they are writing something they won't be alive to revise. Harry and Neville moved closer. They couldn't affect the memory, they were observers only, but they could hear and see and feel the room, and Harry's Slytherin ward, the will-binding one, was resonating with a sustained intensity that was more like recognition than warning. Like meeting someone you were told stories about. Slytherin looked up from his writing, not at Harry, he couldn't see Harry, but toward the window. The grey sky beyond it was the particular grey of Scotland in late November. He said something. Not in English, in something older than English, the angular, structured language that predated the Norman French that had come to the island later and changed everything. But the ward near Harry's shoulder, the knowledge seal, heard it and processed it and delivered it as meaning without words, the way music delivers feeling. I built a thing and I was not honest about why. He looked back at his writing. His quill moved. I was afraid. This is not a defense. I was afraid of what I saw coming, the dilution, the casual borrowing from a power that was not understood, the children dying because their teachers had decided that a wand and a spell was sufficient preparation for a world that does not operate on spells alone. I was afraid and I was also wrong, and the combination of those two things made me do something that I have spent 40 years being unable to entirely regret and entirely justify. He stopped writing. He looked at his hands, scarred, large, the hands of someone who had done both fine and heavy work with them. I put the chamber in the castle. Not for the reason they say, not for the purging, not for the killing, though I understand why that was the interpretation. I put the chamber in the castle because I was afraid that what we had built would be dismantled by cowards, and I wanted to leave something that could not be dismantled. A heart. A place in the stone where the oldest magic could be preserved against any decision any future headmaster might make to simplify, to sanitize, to make safe by making small. He rose from the chair. He walked to the window. The grey sky outside was getting darker, early winter dark, and he looked at it with the expression of someone who has made peace with something difficult and is checking to make sure the peace has held. I also left something else. Something I told no one, not even Helga, though I think she guessed. The Slytherin ward signatures in the castle's foundation, I did not write them as protections for Slytherin students specifically. I wrote them as protections against compulsion, against mental violation, against the specific evil of one mind being made to serve another without consent. I had seen it. I had seen a generation of magical children whose minds had been bent by older magic they hadn't chosen. I was not going to leave a school in the world without a defense against that. He turned from the window. He looked at the room, his fire, his winter, and his expression was the expression of a man reaching the end of something and finding it approximately correct. Whoever you are, if you are seeing this, the castle showed you. The castle decided you were ready for it. That means you carry something I spent my life worried would be lost. The Parseltongue is the least of it. The Parseltongue is a language, all languages are just ways of asking the world to be honest with you. What matters is the ward against compulsion. What matters is that it is yours now, and you understand what it was built for, and you do not let anyone, regardless of their power or their kindness or the quality of their intentions, reach into your mind and rearrange it to suit their purposes. He sat back down. That is all I have. I hope it is enough. I hope you are enough. I hope, whoever you are, that you are less afraid than I was. The memory dissolved. Harry came back into Dumbledore's office with the particular clarity of someone who has just been told something enormous by the person it was most important to hear it from, and he stood at the Pensieve's edge and looked at Dumbledore with the full, direct attention of someone who has just had several things confirmed simultaneously. Neville sat down. He was very quiet, which was different from his usual quiet, this was the quiet of someone processing at full capacity. Hermione's quill had stopped. She was watching Harry. Dumbledore was watching Harry too. He built the compulsion ward, Harry said. The Slytherin ward, the one that prevents mental intrusion and mind-bending. He built it specifically because he'd seen magical children having their minds altered. Yes, Dumbledore said. The Chamber of Secrets was never about blood purity. It was reinterpreted that way, Dumbledore said carefully. By Tom Riddle, specifically, who found the chamber in his 5th year and understood its mechanism but not, I believe, its intent. A pause. He took the monster and the language and the access and he constructed the narrative that suited him. A chamber of secrets to purge the school of those he decided were unworthy. It was simpler than the truth, and it gave him a mythology. He was wrong about what it was for, Harry said. Yes. And he built his entire identity on that misreading. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Tom Riddle was a very brilliant boy who made himself into something that was no longer quite a person, he said. He understood power with extraordinary precision and he understood people not at all. Yes. He built himself on a misreading and could not be told he was wrong because he had become, by the time anyone might have told him, incapable of the vulnerability that being wrong requires. The room was very still. What does this have to do with the compulsion ward? Hermione said. She was not letting the conversation drift. This was Hermione at full operational capacity, tracking the thread. Specifically with the ward on Harry. Voldemort's method, Dumbledore said, relies heavily on compulsion. Not exclusively the Imperious Curse, that is the crude instrument. His deeper work operates on a level closer to what Slytherin was describing in that memory. The bending of minds over time, through presence, through proximity, through the gradual erosion of a person's sense of their own will. He looked at Harry. When Voldemort attempted to kill you, and your mother's sacrifice created the protection that reflected the curse, something happened that we don't fully understand. The interaction of her sacrificial magic and his attempt on your life created a bond. Not a benign one. He left something in you. Harry said nothing. The Slytherin compulsion ward activated that night, Dumbledore said. It was dormant in your magical inheritance, one of the 56, already present in your core before the sorting, simply unrecognized. When his curse struck you, the ward responded. It sealed something. A compartment, essentially. The connection that formed between you and Voldemort, the accidental Horcrux, the shard of his soul that embedded in your scar, the what, Hermione said. Dumbledore closed his eyes briefly. I intended to tell you this at 17. Tell me now, Harry said. His voice was level. The ward near his collarbone was pulsing with absolute steady urgency, not alarm but the fullest version of this matters. All of it. Dumbledore told them all of it. It took 40 minutes. He sat down partway through, which was the only outward indication that the telling cost him something. He described Horcruxes with the careful precision of a man delivering a diagnosis, what they were, how they were made, how many Voldemort had created, and what the 7th one was. He described the plan he'd been constructing for years, the careful collection of intelligence, the identification of each Horcrux's likely location, the arc that led, in his version, to a Harry Potter who walked into death willingly at 17 and came back and ended the war. When he finished, the office was very quiet. Hermione's quill had long since stopped. She was sitting with her hands flat on her thighs and her jaw set in the particular way it set when she was holding back a response that needed more space than the current moment could contain. Neville was looking at the middle distance, the green-gold light on his hands brighter than it had been since the memory room, pulsing in a rhythm that matched Harry's Hufflepuff wards, the loyalty anchors, working. Harry looked at the pensieve. He looked at the leather folder. He looked at Dumbledore. You plan to let me die, he said. I plan to give you the knowledge and the choice, Dumbledore said. At the correct time. The correct time being when I was old enough to make the choice but young enough not to have developed too many alternatives. A pause. Harry, no, Harry said, and his voice was still level, still clear, and this was the ward Slytherin had built. Harry understood it now, the one that prevented compulsion and bending, the one that kept his mind unambiguously his own. I hear what you're saying. I hear that you believe it was the right plan. I hear that you were working with incomplete information for a long time and that you were doing it for reasons that were genuinely about stopping Voldemort and not about, not only about the other things. He paused. But I want to be clear about something. Dumbledore waited. I'm not going to walk into a death you've planned for me, Harry said. Not at 17, not at any age. Not because I'm afraid to die, I don't think I am, actually, but because that's not the plan anymore. If there's a piece of Voldemort's soul in my scar, we will find a way to remove it that doesn't involve me dying. If there are Horcruxes to destroy, we'll destroy them. But we'll do it on terms that I've chosen, with information I've had access to, with a team I've selected. He looked at Dumbledore. I'm not a piece on your board. The portraits around the room had all woken up. They were watching with the intense attention of people who have seen many things and recognize when they are seeing something that will be described to future generations. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long time. Something was happening in his expression, something real, something that didn't belong to any of the versions of himself that he typically performed. It was older than those versions and less certain and more honest. No, he said quietly. You're not. Then we work together, Harry said. Actually together. You share information when it's relevant, not when you've decided I'm ready for it. In exchange, I'll tell you what the wards are showing me as I understand them, and I'll ask before I do things that have consequences beyond my own life. That is a remarkably mature proposal, Dumbledore said. The wards are 1,000 years old, Harry said. Some of the maturity is borrowed. Hermione made a sound that was almost a laugh, suppressed fast, but her eyes were bright. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment, and then he said, there is something else. Something I did not include in my initial account because I wanted to see whether you would ask the right questions first. He opened the leather folder again. Near the back, behind the records, was a single sheet of parchment, newer than the rest, his own copperplate. The 9 wards that belonged to the castle itself. Not the founders. The castle's own. What are they? Harry said. Protections against the headmaster, Dumbledore said. Against any headmaster. Helga Hufflepuff's final addition to the protocol, she was a thorough woman and she appears to have understood that whoever carried the full inheritance would need protection not only from external threats, but from institutional ones. A pause. They cannot be overridden by the headmaster's authority. By any staff member's authority. By the ministry's authority. They are the castle's own declaration that the person carrying them is not subject to institutional coercion. The ward near his collarbone pulsed. Full, steady, complete. She planned for this, Harry said. She planned for you specifically, Dumbledore said. Or rather, for whoever you turned out to be. She understood that power like this would attract management. And she made sure the castle would refuse to allow it. Outside, the morning had progressed to full grey-white Scottish daylight, the kind that was not dramatic but was honest, even and clear. Fawkes made another low sound from his perch. The ward script on Harry's arms caught the light and held it. Hermione was writing again, fast, comprehensive, the scratch of quill on parchment, the sound of someone building a foundation. Neville was looking at Harry with the expression of someone who has signed up for something larger than they initially understood and has decided this is not a problem. Harry looked at Dumbledore, this complicated, powerful, well-meaning, dangerous old man who had just, in 40 minutes, undone years of careful architecture and told the truth to an 11-year-old who had made him uncomfortable enough to require it. One more thing, Harry said. Yes. Quirrell. Dumbledore went very still. The smell in that classroom, Harry said. It's not garlic. It's something else, something wrong and chemical, like copper and old lightning. The observational ward lights up in his classroom like it does nowhere else in the castle. And during his lessons, there's a searching quality, a reaching, that the Slytherin ward shuts down every time. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. You already know. I have suspicions, Dumbledore said, and his voice had changed completely, all layers stripped away. How long have you had them? Since July. And you let him teach? I needed to understand the extent of it, Dumbledore said. And I needed to know what he was looking for. He's looking for me, Harry said. Not a question. He is looking, Dumbledore said carefully, for something he believes you can lead him to. Something in the castle. Something we have been protecting. Harry thought about the Philosopher's Stone, which he'd heard about from Hagrid in a moment of characteristic and cheerful indiscretion at the start of term feast, though he hadn't connected it to Quirrell until right now. The ward near his collarbone pulsed 4 times in quick succession. The stone is in this castle, Harry said. Yes, Dumbledore said. And Quirrell, and whatever is riding Quirrell, wants it. Yes. And your plan was to keep it safe until he showed his hand, Dumbledore said. Which he has not yet done openly. He showed his hand the first day of classes, Harry said. He just showed it to me and the ward blocked it before he knew what he'd reached. Dumbledore absorbed this. He looked at Harry with something that was, undeniably and without performance, respect. The real kind, the kind you don't decide to display but that arrives on your face before you've made a decision about it. The stone, Harry said. Where is it? In a secure location beneath the school, Dumbledore said. With a series of protections designed to stop any ordinary, I want to know what the protections are, Harry said. Not to bypass them. So that I know what I'm working with if this develops faster than you expect. He paused. Because it will develop faster than you expect. He can't reach me through the Slytherin ward, which means I'm an obstacle in whatever plan he has. Obstacles don't stay obstacles indefinitely, they become targets. The room was very quiet again. You are, Dumbledore said slowly, absolutely correct. I know, Harry said. He stood. Thank you for the records. And for the pensieve. And for telling me the things you didn't want to tell me. He picked up his bag. I'll tell you when the wards show me something relevant to the stone. He walked toward the door. Hermione stood, gathered her notes, followed. Neville stood, secured Trevor, followed. At the door, Harry stopped. He turned back one more time, and what he said came from somewhere genuine, somewhere that had nothing to do with the wards or the inheritance or the 1,000-year weight of the castle's recognition. He chose ruin, Harry said. Voldemort. Slytherin said it in the memory. Tom Riddle was wrong about what the chamber was for, and he built himself on that misreading, and he couldn't be told he was wrong because that would mean everything he'd become was wrong too. He chose ruin rather than revision. A pause. That's the real lesson in those records. Not the wards. Not the inheritance. That. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. You've been revising. I wanted you to know I see that. He left. In the corridor, descending the spiral staircase, Hermione said quietly, Harry. Are you all right? Given what he told you about you and Voldemort and the, yes, Harry said. And he meant it, which surprised him slightly and then didn't. The ward Slytherin had built was a compartment, a seal, a protection against the shard of foreign soul embedded in his scar for 10 years. It had been working the entire time. He had never, not once, been unprotected. He had just not known it. We need to research Horcrux removal, Hermione said, with the focused efficiency of someone who has converted shock into action. We need to be careful what we research and where, Harry said. Umbridge is still in this castle. I'll be discreet, Hermione said, in the tone of someone for whom discretion was a professional skill rather than an afterthought. And I need to talk to the castle, Harry said. Neville looked at him. Talk to it? The memory room. The ward records in the stone. Harry looked at his hands. Slytherin said whoever the castle showed his memory to was ready. The castle has been showing me things since I arrived, in order, and each thing has been a step. The memory was the step before last. He started walking. I want to know what the last step is. Behind them, very faintly, in the upper room they'd left, Fawkes sang a single phrase, clear and firebright, a sound that had the quality of a door opening onto something that had been waiting for it to open. The ward script on Harry's arms lit up, all 56 patterns simultaneously, bright as midday, and held. Chapter 5, Blood of the Castle. The memory room was different at night. Harry hadn't planned on coming at night specifically. The plan had been to return after dinner, after the normal flow of the day had given him and Hermione and Neville time to process Dumbledore's disclosures and the weight of Slytherin's memory. But the afternoon had developed its own momentum, the way days do when too many important things have happened too close together, and by the time they'd gotten through lunch and a double herbology period and the particular social navigation of a Gryffindor common room that had spent a week developing strong opinions about Harry Potter, it was gone 10 o'clock and the castle was settling into its nighttime configuration. Harry came alone. Not because he'd decided to keep anything from Hermione or Neville. He told them both where he was going, and Hermione had looked at him with the calculating assessment of someone deciding whether to insist and then deciding that some things needed to be done by one person and one person only. Neville had simply nodded. Both of them had, in their different ways, understood something he hadn't quite articulated, that whatever the castle's next step was, it was going to be personal, and witnesses, however trusted, changed the nature of personal things. The ward script was at full illumination in the dark corridor. Not the sudden flare he'd learned to associate with recognition or urgency, this was sustained and even, all 56 patterns at the same level of brightness, a warm and comprehensive light that moved with him through the fourth-floor passage like carried lantern light. He didn't need the torches. He barely needed his eyes. The door came open before he'd raised his hand. Inside, the memory room was changed. The niches were all lit, every carved tablet glowing at its full sustained brightness, and the cumulative light filled the circular room with something that was neither gold nor white but precisely between them, the color, Harry thought, of a thing that has been a long time in darkness and has finally been given permission to shine. He walked to the center of the room. He stood there for a moment, feeling the 56 patterns on his skin breathe in the same rhythm as the room around him, and he did the thing Slytherin's memory had taught him. He stopped reaching and simply received. The room gave him everything at once. Not like the matchstick's essential nature, quiet and contained. This was a full architectural download, the difference between understanding a room and understanding a building, the Hogwarts ward system laid out in his mind with a clarity so complete it was briefly overwhelming. He understood the layered protections, how they nested inside each other, which ones were dependent on others, which ones stood alone. He understood the regenerative wards, the ones that renewed themselves automatically versus the ones that needed active maintenance. He understood the deep structural enchantments that made the castle itself sentient, the ones Helga Hufflepuff had woven in her final months with the specific intent of ensuring the castle would always, ultimately, choose its students over its administrators. And he understood the damage. It was subtle, the kind of damage that would be invisible to any standard ward examination because it wasn't in any of the standard locations. It was in the 9th of the castle's own wards, the last of the 9 that belonged neither to any founder nor to any protective tradition but to the castle's will alone. Harry had understood this ward, intellectually, since Dumbledore's description in the office, the protection against institutional coercion, the castle's declaration that whoever carried the full inheritance could not be compelled by any authority that operated within the institutional structure. Someone had been trying to breach it. Not all at once. Not with the blunt force approach of a curse or a direct attack, nothing so detectable. This was careful work, patient and incremental, the magical equivalent of slowly shifting a foundation stone by a fraction of a millimeter each night. Done over weeks or months, in small enough increments that no individual moment would register as significant. Harry crouched and put both palms flat on the stone floor. The ward's damage mapped through his hands and up his arms with uncomfortable precision. The breach attempt was coming from below, from the chambers beneath the school, which he now knew housed the Philosopher's Stone. From the protections layered around the stone, specifically. Or more accurately, from a point of interference within those protections that was using the stone's immense magical output as a power source. Something was feeding on the stone's ambient magic and directing it upward through the castle's foundation toward the 9th ward with the slow deliberate patience of something that had a great deal of time and a very specific objective. Not the stone itself. Something using the stone. Harry stood up. He understood immediately why the observational ward had been so active during Quirrell's classes. Whatever was in Quirrell's turban, and Harry's understanding of that situation had crystallized considerably during Dumbledore's morning disclosures, had not merely been looking for Harry. It had been looking at Harry's ward specifically. Trying to find the ninth. Trying to understand the mechanism of the castle's own protection so it could work around it. It had found the ninth, apparently. And it had started working. Harry left the memory room at a walk that was almost a run. He found Hermione and Neville in the common room, which at this hour held only a few scattered older students who looked up when Harry came through the portrait hole and then looked back at whatever they were doing with the practiced curiosity of people who had decided, this week, that looking directly at Harry Potter was not something they wanted to do. The ward glow on his arms was at full brightness, which at this point in the week had become something the Gryffindors had collectively decided was simply a feature of living in the same tower as him, like the way the common room fire burned slightly warmer near his usual chair. Hermione looked up from her parchment. She had been researching, of course, a stack of books from the restricted section that she had obtained by some means she hadn't explained and that Harry suspected involved either McGonagall's explicit assistance or Hermione's ability to project a quality of such complete authorized purposefulness that librarians stepped aside, and read his face in about a second and a half. "What happened?" she said. "The castle's ninth ward is being breached," he said. "From below. Something in the chambers with the stone is using its power output to run a sustained low-level attack on the protection that prevents institutional coercion." Neville set down his herbology homework. "What does that mean in practice? What happens if the ninth ward fails?" "The castle loses the ability to refuse headmaster-level override on the full inheritance," Harry said. "Which means Dumbledore, or anyone operating as headmaster, could theoretically use the castle's authority structure to access the inheritance directly. To examine it. Modify it. Potentially to compel it." "Compel you," Hermione said. "Yes." She stood up. She did not ask if he was sure, she looked at his face and the ward light and made her determination. "How much time?" "I don't know exactly. The damage is incremental. My guess is days, not hours, but I don't want to guess wrong." He looked at them both. "I need to go below. Find the source and address it." "Address it how?" Neville said. "I don't know yet," Harry said honestly. "The castle will show me when I'm there. It's been operating that way since Saturday, the understanding arrives when I arrive." Hermione took approximately 2 seconds to evaluate the proposal against every reasonable objection and then said, "We're coming." "Hermione, don't," she said simply. "Just don't." "Where do we go?" The third-floor corridor that Dumbledore had warned them away from on the first night led, via a trapdoor that Harry's wards opened as they approached it, into a series of chambers that descended in stages beneath the school. The drop was significant but survivable. Hermione cushioned it with a softening charm she'd apparently been practicing since Tuesday in preparation for situations exactly like this one, which told Harry something about the quality of Hermione's general preparedness. They landed in a chamber of deep, old dark. The devil's snare was there, and it moved for Harry before he'd raised his wand. The plant shifted its tendrils back with the slow deference of something responding to a signal below the threshold of ordinary magic, the Hufflepuff earth wards resonating with the plant's own natural intelligence. Neville stepped forward and spread his hands, and the green-gold light poured from his palms in a soft sustained wave, and the devil's snare retreated entirely to the chamber walls and stayed there. They looked at him. He shrugged, carefully neutral about how extraordinary this was. "It's a plant," he said. "I told it we weren't a threat." "You told it," Hermione said. "The light told it," Neville said. "I just sent the intention." The next chamber held 1,000 birds, or the magical equivalent, winged keys that swarmed the space in a continuous shifting cloud of iridescent motion. There was a broomstick in the corner. Harry didn't touch it. He stood in the center of the chamber and looked at the swarm with the intent quality that the Ravenclaw ward produced in him, and the correct key, old, large, one wing slightly bent, simply separated itself from the swarm and descended into his open hand. How? Hermione said. The Ravenclaw ward read the lock before we entered the room, Harry said. It just recognized the relationship between lock and key. Like knowing the answer to a question you haven't been asked yet. The chest chamber was large and cold and the pieces were enormous, carved from dark stone, and they turned to regard the three of them as they entered with the implacable attention of things that have been waiting for a game and intend to have one. Harry looked at the board. The Ravenclaw ward laid the solution over the position like a transparency, every piece's optimal move clear and sequential, the path from entry to exit as navigable as a corridor. He moved the pieces. 4 moves. The board opened. Through the troll chamber, the troll was already unconscious, which Dumbledore had apparently arranged in advance, which told Harry that the headmaster's awareness of the stone situation was more detailed and more urgent than he disclosed this morning. This was filed away without judgment, a data point rather than a grievance. The potion chamber was dark and precise, a dozen bottles on a table and a logic puzzle that Hermione solved in 40 seconds with the focused satisfaction of someone finally encountering a challenge commensurate with their preparation. They went through the black flame. The final chamber was different from the others in a way that Harry felt before he saw it. The quality of the air changed, became charged, the ward script on his arms flaring from sustained brightness to active pulsing. The chamber held the mirror of Eriste and nothing else, which was wrong, because the stone should have been somewhere in this room. The mirror was large and old and its gold frame was tarnished nearly to black and it stood against the far wall facing the entrance and Harry looked at it from across the chamber and deliberately looked away. He looked instead at the floor. Near the mirror's base, barely visible unless you were looking for it, was the point of interference he'd sensed from the memory room. It was invisible to normal sight, it had no physical presence, no mark, no indication that anything was wrong. But the ward light from his skin hit the floor at that point and scattered, the way light scatters when it hits a lens rather than a flat surface. Something was there. Something had been built there over weeks of patient, incremental, midnight work. A leech. Not a biological one. A magical construct, intricate and deeply wrong in its wrongness, built to draw power from the stone's ambient output and redirect it upward through the castle's foundation. Harry crouched over it and the observational ward, the angular one that had been his most reliable instrument since the sorting, mapped it completely in the space of 3 seconds. It was not Quirrell's work. Not directly. Quirrell didn't have the magical precision for this, he was a capable if mediocre academic wizard being ridden by something that was considerably more than that. But the something that was riding Quirrell did not have a body, which meant it could not have been physically present in this chamber to build the leech. It had used Quirrell's hands, but the design was the other one's, the brilliant, broken intelligence of Tom Riddle, who understood power with extraordinary precision and had spent 43 years in the spaces between life and death with nothing to do but plan. "Can you break it?" Hermione said, from behind him. "Yes," Harry said. "But not by force. If I break it by force, the energy it's been storing will discharge back into the ward system and the damage it's already done will accelerate." "So how?" Harry looked at the leech for a long moment. The knowledge seal was working, reading the construct's architecture, following its logic, finding the point where Riddle's design had made an assumption. There it was. Small, elegant, almost perfect. He'd assumed that any counter-effort would come from the external side, from someone trying to undo the work at the castle's foundation. He hadn't accounted for the construct being addressed from within the ward system itself. From someone who was part of the ward system. "I need to pull it inward," Harry said. "Into the ward structure rather than breaking it from outside. Like, absorbing it. The 9th ward can reintegrate its own damage if the repair comes from inside." "You're part of the ward structure," Neville said. "Yes. That's going to hurt," Neville said, with the flat certainty of someone who has no medical training but a reliable instinct for when things are going to hurt. "Probably," Harry said. "Do it," Hermione said. She moved to his left side. Neville moved to his right. "We're here." Harry put both hands flat on the floor over the leech. The ward script on his arms went from active pulsing to full brilliant activation, every single pattern, all 56, burning at an intensity that filled the chamber with gold-white light and cast long shadows from the mirror's frame. He felt the leech through his palms, felt its stored energy, its architecture, the patient weeks of riddles planning encoded in it. He felt the ninth ward above him, damaged and straining, the incremental wear of each night's work visible now as clearly as cracks in old stone. He pulled. The leech resisted. Not because it was designed to resist, it wasn't, it was designed to be invisible, not impervious, but because the stored energy pushed back, and the stored energy was considerable. Weeks of the philosopher's stone's output. Weeks of one of the most powerful magical objects in existence radiating ambient power into a contained construct. Harry's arms lit up to the shoulder, to the collarbone, and he was aware of pain. Yes, Neville had been correct, a deep structural burning that was less like being hurt and more like being very thoroughly heated all the way through. He pulled harder. The Slytherin ward engaged, the will binding, the one Slytherin had built against compulsion. Not because this was compulsion but because the ward recognized the quality of the resistance, an external will pushing against Harry's own, trying to maintain its architecture in his hands. The ward responded the same way it responded to Quirrell's classroom searching, a door closing, firm and absolute, the sense of Harry's own will becoming irresistibly solid. The leech came apart. Not explosively. It dissolved, the stored energy flowing up through Harry's arms and into the ward structure above him, not as damage but as the ward's own power being returned to it. The ninth ward took it in and Harry felt, with the clarity of someone directly connected to a thing that is healing, the cracks filling. The incremental damage of weeks reversing. The ward settling back into its full integrity. All 56 patterns pulsed once, in unison, and went steady. Harry sat back on his heels and breathed. His arms felt like he'd held them in front of a fire for too long, sensitive, overtaxed, functional but done for the evening. He looked at his hands. The ward script was still there, still readable, still his. "Done," he said. "Are you hurt?" Hermione said immediately. "Sore," he said. "Not hurt. I'll be fine by morning." That, she said, was remarkable. That, Neville said, from Harry's right, was the bravest thing I've ever seen and I've been awake for most of my life. Harry looked at him. Something about the phrasing, the quiet, dry specificity of it, landed in the middle of the conversation and made both Harry and Hermione go still for a moment. "You've been awake," Harry said. Neville looked at his own hands, the steady green gold, calm as it had been for days now. "Before the ward activated at the sorting," he said, "I spent most of my time just, waiting to get things wrong. Preparing for disappointment. It's very tiring." He paused. "This is better." They started back toward the trapdoor. They didn't talk about what to tell Dumbledore on the way back through the chambers, but by the time they climbed back through the trapdoor and into the third-floor corridor, they'd reached a wordless consensus. Harry told Dumbledore everything, the damage, the leech, the repair, because he'd made an agreement with the man that morning and he intended to keep it, and also because Dumbledore needed to know that Riddle's strategy had shifted. He was no longer waiting for Quirrell to retrieve the stone. He was trying to remove the castle's ability to protect its heir. That meant the timeline had changed. Dumbledore's office at midnight responded to Harry's knock after about 4 seconds, which was either the headmaster's insomnia or the gargoyle deciding that a first-year student with fully active founder wards showing up at midnight was worth waking the headmaster for. Dumbledore answered the door in his dressing gown, which was remarkable mostly because it was purple and had small silver stars, and looked at Harry with the sharpened attention of someone whose mind went from 0 to complete operational capacity faster than almost anyone Harry had encountered. Harry told him. Brief, sequential, accurate. Dumbledore listened without interrupting. When Harry finished, Dumbledore said, "The stone must be moved." "Tonight," Harry agreed. "I will handle it," Dumbledore said. "Tonight, as you say." He paused. "You repaired the ninth ward." "Yes." That should not have been possible, Dumbledore said. The ninth ward is part of the castle's autonomous structure. It doesn't respond to direct magical intervention, it's not designed to. Attempting to repair it from outside would be like trying to repair your own heartbeat by reaching into your chest. I didn't repair it from outside, Harry said. I absorbed the leech into the ward structure. I'm part of the ward structure. Dumbledore was very quiet. Helga Hufflepuff's design, Harry said. The carrier of the full inheritance isn't just protected by the wards. They're connected to them. Bidirectionally. They can maintain them from within. He paused. I think that's what the ninth ward is actually for. Not just protection from institutional coercion. An active maintenance function. The castle has been waiting for someone who could keep it healthy from the inside. Like a caretaker, Dumbledore said. But at the deepest structural level. Yes, Harry said. The headmaster was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the silver instruments on his spindle tables ticked through several cycles of their mysterious rotations. Fawkes watched from his perch with the patient golden attention he'd had that morning. I owe you an apology, Dumbledore said. Not for the first time today, and likely not for the last. I know, Harry said. Get the stone moved. We can talk about the rest in the morning. He turned to go. Harry. He stopped. Quirrell will know the leech is gone, Dumbledore said. By tomorrow morning, at the latest, whatever is riding him will know the attempt failed and will understand why. It will understand that you were in those chambers, and that you repaired the ward, and that the stone is now beyond its reach. A pause. It will also understand that you are far more than it anticipated when it planned this approach. Good, Harry said. That makes you a direct target. You mentioned that this morning, Harry said. I've been one since I was a year old. I'm used to it. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. Move the stone. And tomorrow, before anything else, we talk about Quirrell. He walked back to Gryffindor Tower with Hermione and Neville on either side of him, the ward light steady and warm, and the castle's nighttime configuration settling around them with the gentle purposefulness it had shown him since the first night, torches brightening on the correct path, staircases holding, the deep structural thrum of ancient stone that he could now read as clearly as language. The castle knew what had happened in those chambers. It had felt the ninth ward repaired. Harry could feel its response in the quality of that thrum, the same rhythm as his own wards, the same pattern, but wider now, more settled. Like a body that has been holding a muscle tense for a very long time and has finally been allowed to relax. He pressed his palm briefly against the corridor wall as they passed. The stone was warm. The next morning had the particular crackling quality of a day that had decided to matter. Harry noticed it from the moment he woke, not dread, not apprehension, but the charged attentiveness of the ward script, already running at elevated brightness before he'd properly opened his eyes. He washed, dressed, went downstairs, and found Hermione already in the common room with her restricted section research organized into a coherent sequence on the table in front of her. I found something, she said, without preamble. On Horcrux removal. Specifically on soul fragment extraction without fatal consequence to the host. Harry sat down. It's theoretical, she said. Very old theory, preministry, buried in a text called The Sovereign Soul by Beatrice Lawley, 1683. She was researching the nature of accidental soul transference, situations where soul fragments were embedded in living hosts against their will, through violence or magical accident. She turned the book toward him. She describes a process she calls sovereign expulsion. The host's own magic, if sufficiently integrated and strong, can reject a foreign soul fragment the way a body rejects a foreign object. Force it out. Harry read the relevant passage. The Ravenclaw ward moved through it at its reading ahead quality, and the outline of the process was clear, a period of intensive magical self-assertion, the strengthening of the host's own magical identity to the point where the foreign fragment became obviously incompatible, followed by an expulsion event that would not be comfortable but would be survivable. The ward Slytherin built, Harry said slowly. The will binding. The compulsion resistance. That's been doing this already. I think so too, Hermione said. Since Halloween 1981. It's been asserting your magical identity against the soul fragment for 10 years. The expulsion might not even require a deliberate process, it might happen naturally as your magic develops and the ward strengthens. Harry put the book down. He looked at his arms, at the Slytherin ward pattern, and felt it with the awareness that had become as natural as breathing. It was one of the most active patterns at baseline, a constant, low-level presence, steady and watchful, exactly as described. Doing exactly what Slytherin had designed it to do. When? He said. I don't know, Hermione said honestly. Lolly doesn't give a timeline. But she says the process accelerates when the host actively engages with their own magical nature. Learns it. Uses it deliberately. She looked at him. Which you've been doing for 5 days. The common room was beginning to fill as Gryffindors came downstairs for breakfast, and the normal morning social environment was assembling itself around them. Ron appeared from the boys' staircase with the hair of someone who'd slept deeply and well and had no concerns more pressing than food. Breakfast, he said. Yes, Harry said. He stood. To Hermione, quietly, we tell McGonagall today. About the chambers and the ward repair. Before or after Dumbledore talks to Quirrell? Before, Harry said. McGonagall should know regardless of what Dumbledore does next. She said she wanted to be working with the full picture. She meant it, Hermione agreed. Walking to the Great Hall, Harry passed Quirrell in the entrance hall, a genuine pass, unplanned, the man coming from the direction of the dungeons with the specific gait of someone who has just been somewhere and has arranged their face to look like they haven't. Their eyes met. Quirrell stopped walking. Harry stopped walking. The ward structure around Harry was at full operational baseline, all 56 patterns steady and clear, the Slytherin ward specifically present, the observational ward awake and mapping. He looked at Quirrell and through the layers of badly applied performance and deliberate mediocrity at what was underneath, and what was underneath was looking back at him with an intelligence that was not Quirrell's. It was the first time they'd made direct contact. Classroom exposure was glancing. This was eye to eye, a few feet of corridor, nothing between them. The presence riding Quirrell reached. It was subtle, far subtler than the classroom searching, and considerably more powerful. This was not a probe for information. This was an attempt to establish a direct line, to put something through, to find a crack in the word structure through which it could pass an impression, a compulsion, a single directing thought. The Slytherin ward closed around it like a hand closing over smoke. Not just blocked. Reversed. The ward didn't simply prevent entry, it reflected the reaching back to its source with enough clarity that whatever had reached could not mistake what had happened. It had not found a crack. It had found a wall so structurally complete that the attempt itself had been catalogued, identified, and returned to sender with the calm efficiency of a postal system. Quirrell's face went white. Not frightened white. Recognizing white. The intelligence behind his eyes understood in that moment, completely, what it was dealing with. And it understood, Harry could see it understanding, that the approach it had been using for weeks was not going to work. Not now, not ever. Harry held its gaze for 3 more seconds, steady, unhurried. Then he walked past Quirrell to breakfast. The ward near his collarbone was pulsing. Not the double-quick pay-attention rhythm. Something slower and more final, a rhythm he hadn't catalogued yet, that felt like the closing of a chapter. He sat down at the Gryffindor table between Ron and Neville and reached for the toast, and the great hall was loud and ordinary around him, and somewhere in the castle's deep foundation the ninth ward breathed steady and whole, and the ancient magic that Helga Hufflepuff had threaded through the building's bones 1,000 years ago continued its patient, purposeful work. Maintaining. Protecting. Waiting for what came next. Harry buttered his toast and thought about what came next. It was coming fast now. He could feel it in the elevated attentiveness of the wards, in the quality of the castles thrum beneath the flagstone floor, in the way the candles in the great hall burned slightly steadier and brighter than usual, as though the building itself was preparing. Quirrell sat down at the head table. He kept his eyes on his plate. Dumbledore was not at the head table. Harry noted this, ate his toast, and watched the morning light come through the enchanted windows, gold and ordinary and clear. Whatever was coming, he was ready. The castle was ready. For the first time in 1,000 years, they were ready together. Chapter 6, The Heir of All, the Ward of None. Dumbledore returned to Hogwarts at noon. Harry knew the moment he crossed the castle's boundary, felt it through the ward structure the way you feel a familiar hand on a door you're leaning against. The headmaster's magical signature had become legible to him over the past week in the same way voices become legible, their particular quality and weight distinguishable from others. Dumbledore's was vast and precise and carried with it the particular density of someone who had been doing magic for over a century and had developed, through sheer sustained practice, a relationship with it that was architecturally complex. He arrived in the great hall during lunch, and every head turned, not because he was late, but because of the quality of his entrance. He walked through the doors with the focused energy of someone who had done something significant and was already thinking about what came next, and he went directly to the head table without stopping, which was notable because Dumbledore stopping to exchange pleasantries on the way to a destination was as reliable as the tides. He sat down. He spoke briefly to McGonagall on his left. McGonagall's expression shifted by approximately 2 degrees, still contained, still precise, but something in her eyes sharpened into readiness. Harry ate his soup and watched. Quirrell was not at the head table. This was not a surprise, but it was a confirmation. Harry had told McGonagall everything before breakfast. He and Hermione had caught her in her office at 7:30, and she had listened with the focused immobility of someone who can hear very alarming information without either minimizing it or panicking, and McGonagall had looked at them both when they finished and said, with the flat certainty of someone naming the correct answer, "He'll have to be removed from the school today." She'd been right. Across the table, Neville was eating steadily and watching the head table with the quiet peripheral awareness he'd been developing all week, the green-gold light absent at the moment, controlled and internalized now rather than surface bright, which Hermione had described as a healthy development and which Harry thought made Neville look exactly like what he was becoming, someone who had power and understood it and had decided to carry it without performance. Ron, beside Harry, had been conducting a separate investigation into the soup and had strong opinions about the potato quantity. He was, Harry thought, wonderfully normal in a week that had contained very little of that, and he was grateful for it in a way he hadn't found words for yet but intended to eventually. Hermione was reading. She was always reading. Currently it appeared to be Advanced Magical Theory by Adalbert Waffling, which was technically 5th-year material, and she was 3/4 through it and had flagged 11 pages with small strips of torn parchment. Harry had noticed, over the course of the week, that Hermione's reading had shifted in character. She was still voracious and comprehensive, but the things she was voracious about had reorganized themselves around usefulness rather than curriculum. She was reading to understand rather than to pass examinations, which was a distinction Harry thought probably mattered enormously. He was halfway through his soup when the ward near his collarbone shifted from its baseline pulse to the double-quick rhythm. Not the slow, final cadence he'd felt after passing Quirrell in the corridor. The sharp, immediate pay attention that meant something was developing right now. He looked at the entrance to the great hall. Umbridge had come back. She was not alone. Behind her were 2 wizards in ministry robes, not purple, which would have been the general ministry, but a particular deep blue-gray that Harry's week of reading had taught him was the color of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement's investigative division. Not observers. Investigators. People with the authority to compel testimony, examine magical artifacts, and in some circumstances remove persons of interest from a location for formal questioning. They were looking at Harry. Umbridge was smiling her policy smile. The investigators had the carefully neutral expressions of people who have been briefed on a situation and intend to address it efficiently. Harry set down his spoon. "Hermione," he said quietly. I see them, she said, without looking up from waffling. Neville. Yes, Neville said. Ron looked up from his soup, looked at the entrance, looked back at Harry with an expression that had shed its usual ease and replaced it with something older and more alert. What do you need? He said, simply. Harry looked at him, this straightforward, practically minded, genuinely good person who had been Harry's first friend in the magical world and who had not, through an entire week of extremely unusual events, done anything other than accept them as facts and ask what was useful. Nothing right now, Harry said. Stay here. He stood up. The great hall was still at full lunch population, 800 students, every table occupied, the noise level steady and oblivious. Harry walked toward the entrance and the ward light brightened on his arms and several nearby Gryffindors noticed and went quiet and the quiet spread outward the way quiet does in enclosed spaces, one person's attention drawing another's until by the time Harry reached the midpoint of the hall the noise had dropped by half. Umbridge stepped forward to meet him, arms folded in front of her with the authority of someone who has prepared for this moment. Mr. Potter, she said. Her voice carried in the diminishing noise. We need to have a conversation. All right, Harry said pleasantly. Have it. Privately, she said. I'm comfortable here, Harry said. So are you, I imagine, given that you brought investigators into a school lunchroom. The smile shifted slightly. This is a formal matter. The Ministry has concerns about the magical anomaly that occurred at your sorting ceremony, concerns about student safety, about the nature of the ward patterns currently active on your person, and about your refusal to participate in a standard diagnostic assessment. She tilted her head. We have authority to require that assessment, Mr. Potter. Do you? Harry said. Show me the Wisengamot order. A pause. The smile held but its edges tightened. The authority for examining a minor student's magical signature, Harry said, requires a Wisengamot order signed by a minimum of 15 members, countersigned by the student's designated magical guardian, and presented to the school's headmaster in writing at least 72 hours before the examination. That's Statute 14, Section 3 of the Hogwarts Educational Charter, which predates the Ministry by about 400 years. He looked at her steadily. Do you have the order? The great hall was very quiet now. Harry could feel the weight of 800 people paying close attention. Umbridge's smile was entirely mechanical. The statute you cite applies to standard examinations. The anomaly at your sorting constitutes an exceptional circumstance under the Magical Hazard Assessment, the Magical Hazard Assessment Act of 1934, Harry said, because the Ravenclaw ward had been filing information for a week and Hermione's research notes were comprehensive, applies to magical events that present a demonstrable threat to persons or property. The ward activation at the sorting presented no threat to any person or property. No student was harmed. No property was damaged. The castle itself facilitated the event, which means the castle's own enchantments determined it was safe and appropriate. He paused. The Magical Hazard Assessment Act specifically excludes events sanctioned by the host structure's own enchantments. One of the investigators looked at the other. It was a very small look. It had the quality of two professionals quietly acknowledging that their brief had not covered this specific scenario. You are 11 years old, Umbridge said. Yes, Harry agreed. It's been a good week for it. Several students at the Gryffindor table made sounds that were arguably not laughter. Mr. Potter. Umbridge dropped the sweetness entirely, and what was underneath was exactly as unpleasant as Harry had expected but also somehow more honest for being visible. The Ministry has a legitimate interest in understanding what you are. The magical community has a right to know what kind of power is walking around Hogwarts. You are not a private citizen with private concerns, you are the boy who lived, and that designation carries obligations. No, Harry said. I beg your, no, he said again, and his voice was even and clear and had none of the shape of a child being defiant, which was what she was hoping for, something she could characterize as immaturity and override. I'm not a designation. I'm a person. The ward patterns you're concerned about are mine, they belong to my magical inheritance, they're operated by my magical core, and they exist to protect me. That protection specifically includes protection against institutional examination that I haven't consented to. He looked at her without hostility, which seemed to confuse her more than hostility would have. The ministry doesn't get to decide what I am. The castle already decided what I am, and it did it with 1,000 years of considered intent and significantly more authority than the ministries formed in 1707. The hall was completely silent. "We will be speaking to the headmaster," Umbridge said, very quietly. "Yes," said Dumbledore. He was at the head table, standing, having arrived at some point during the exchange with the characteristic Dumbledore quality of simply being exactly where the moment needed him. But his voice was different, not the public address warmth or the careful diplomatic register. This was the voice underneath all those, stripped clean, and it was enormous. The voice of a man who had been doing magic and navigating political power for over a century and had decided that today was not a day for instruments. "You will speak to me," Dumbledore said, "in my office, having presented the appropriate Wisengamot authorization. Until you have that authorization, you will not speak to my students, you will not examine my students, and you will not remain in this hall during a school meal intimidating 11-year-old children." He looked at Umbridge with the absolute calm of a glacier encountering a tide and finding it insufficient. "You are, of course, welcome to stay for lunch." Umbridge looked at Dumbledore. She looked at Harry. Something was happening in her expression, a recalibration of a different kind from the ones Harry had been cataloguing all week. Not revision of information. A reassessment of terrain. She had arrived here expecting a confused child and an elderly headmaster playing careful politics, and she had found something else entirely and was now doing the arithmetic on what that meant for her report to the minister. She turned and walked out of the great hall. The two investigators followed. The noise returned like water filling a space, gradual, then all at once, an explosion of 800 people having opinions simultaneously. Harry walked back to his seat and sat down and picked up his spoon, and the soup was still warm, which felt like a small victory worth acknowledging. Ron handed him a bread roll. "That," Ron said, "was brilliant." "Hermione did the research," Harry said. "I did do the research," Hermione confirmed. "But you delivered it without notes, which I'll admit I wasn't sure you could." "The Ravenclaw ward," Harry said. "I know," she said. "I'm just saying it's also you." The Wisengamot session was announced by Owl 3 days later. Not a standard owl, a formal ministry bird, grey and official, carrying a scroll sealed with the minister's own wax, delivered to Harry at the Gryffindor table during breakfast with the gravity of an event that had been building for a week and had finally found its form. The scroll informed him that a special session of the Wisengamot had been convened to address matters pertaining to his status, the magical events at Hogwarts, and what the ministry was calling the undisclosed activation of founder-level enchantments on Hogwarts school grounds. He was required to attend. His guardian, listed as Albus Dumbledore, was informed separately. Harry read the scroll. He turned it over, read the back, which contained the legal citation justifying the summons. He set it down. Hermione was reading it before he'd fully released it. "They're creative," she said, with the tone of someone who finds creativity used badly to be a personal offense. "They're using the Hogwarts Governance Act, which gives the ministry authority to convene hearings on matters affecting Hogwarts as an institution, as a workaround for the educational charter's protections. If the hearing is framed as being about the school rather than about you specifically, then the individual rights statutes don't apply," Harry said. "Exactly." She looked up. "They've been planning this since Umbridge left." "Give me a day," Harry said. He spent that day in the memory room. Not passively, not in the receiving, open-handed mode he'd been using since the first night. This time he worked. He moved through the room systematically, touching each tablet in sequence, asking specific questions through the intent channel the knowledge seal provided. Not all of the tablets answered everything, the oldest ones communicated in impressions rather than specifics, and some of the Ravenclaw records were so densely encoded that even the knowledge seal required extended contact to parse them. But by the end of the day he had what he needed, a comprehensive understanding of the Hogwarts Charter's foundational documents, the legal status of the Founder Ward activation, the historical precedent for a carrier of the full inheritance, and, crucially, what that precedent entitled him to. It was not what anyone was expecting. He told Hermione and Neville that evening, and Hermione went very still for approximately 30 seconds, which was her version of shock, and then she said, "That's audacious." "Yes," Harry said. "It's legally sound," she said, which meant she'd reviewed it in real time. "Yes," he said. "They're going to hate it," Neville said. "Probably," Harry said. "Does that change anything?" Neville thought about this for a moment, the green gold light steady on his hands, and shook his head. The Wizengamot convened in a chamber Harry had never seen, not the Ministry's main courtroom, which he'd find out later was reserved for criminal proceedings, but the Charter Chamber, a circular room of pale stone in the depths of the Ministry building in London, ringed by tiered seating that held 53 Wizengamot members in their plum-colored robes, looking down at a central floor where a single chair had been placed. Harry walked in with Dumbledore on his left. He did not sit in the chair. He stood beside it, which produced an immediate ripple of consternation in the tiered seating, not quite protocol, not quite a violation, a minor but deliberate departure from the script that people who rely on protocol notice immediately. The Chief Warlock, a heavy-set man named Ogden, looked at Harry over his spectacles with the expression of someone who has been in this chamber for 30 years and knows when something is off. "Mr. Potter," Ogden said, with careful neutrality. "Please be seated." "I prefer to stand," Harry said. "If that's acceptable." A pause. It was, technically, acceptable. Ogden gestured for the session to proceed. Fudge was there, the Minister for Magic, a round-faced, anxious man in lime-green robes who looked at Harry the way people look at things they find threatening and have been reassured they shouldn't find threatening and still find threatening. He had the quality, Harry thought, of a man who had been told a story about Harry Potter that was specific and useful and was now confronting the person rather than the story, and finding the person did not match the story in any dimension that made him comfortable. Umbridge sat 3 seats from Fudge. Her smile was present. The session began with a formal recitation of the reasons for convening, the Founder Ward activation, the Ministry's assessment concerns, the institutional question of whether Hogwarts had an obligation to disclose significant magical events to the Ministry under the Governance Act. A Wizengamot member Harry didn't know read from a prepared statement about magical safety and public interest and community well-being, and Harry listened to all of it with the patient attention he developed over a week of listening to things that were nominally about him but were actually about what other people needed him to be. Then Ogden said, "Mr. Potter. You may speak." Harry looked at the 53 Wizengamot members, at Fudge, at Umbridge's smile, at Dumbledore standing to his left with his hands loosely folded in front of him and his face carefully composed. "I'm going to do something unusual," Harry said. "I'm going to tell you what the Hogwarts Governance Act actually covers, and then I'm going to explain why this session has been convened under the wrong authority, and then I'm going to tell you what I think should happen instead." He paused. "After that, if you have questions, I'll answer them." The chamber was quiet with the particular quality of people who expected a child and are recalibrating. The Hogwarts Governance Act of 1752 grants the Ministry oversight authority over Hogwarts as an educational institution for matters affecting its operation, student safety, and alignment with Ministry educational standards, Harry said. It does not, and the original charter language is specific on this, it does not grant the Ministry authority over events arising from the castle's own autonomous enchantments. Section 7, Paragraph 4, events generated by the school's foundational magic shall be considered internal to the institution and outside the Ministry's oversight mandate unless they produce a demonstrable harm to persons or the broader magical community. The ward activation at my sorting harmed no one. It produced no threat. The Ministry's basis for this session is therefore the wrong section of the wrong act. A Wizengamot member near the top tier leaned forward. It was a woman Harry didn't recognize, older, sharp-eyed. "You memorized the Governance Act." "I had access to the founding documents," Harry said. "The ones the Hogwarts Charter is based on." The originals, not the current ministry amended version. He let that sit for a moment. Would you like me to identify where the current version differs materially from the founding language? The chamber stirred. Several members exchanged looks. Fudge had gone slightly red. The concern, Fudge said, overriding protocol with the urgency of someone who has been waiting to insert himself, is not merely procedural, Mr. Potter. The concern is that an 11-year-old student is walking around one of Britain's most important institutions carrying 56 active founder-level ward patterns that no one in the ministry's magical assessment division can identify, explain, or evaluate. That is a legitimate concern. Yes, Harry said. It is. He let Fudge have that for a moment, the agreement, which the minister hadn't expected. But the response to a legitimate concern isn't an unauthorized examination of a minor's magical core. The response is to understand what the wards are. He looked at Ogden. I'm prepared to explain them. Fully, openly, in this chamber, with whatever qualified observers you'd like present. Not an examination, a disclosure. On my terms, with my consent. Ogden looked at him for a long moment. You're proposing to tell us voluntarily what you would not allow us to compel. Yes, Harry said. Because the difference between those two things is the entire point. The chamber was very quiet. Harry continued. The 56 ward patterns are the founder-level enchantments of Hogwarts Castle. 12 from Gryffindor's foundational magic, 14 from Ravenclaw's, 11 from Hufflepuff's, 10 from Slytherin's, and 9 belonging to the castle's own autonomous will. They activated because I carry a magical inheritance from all 4 founders' lines of transmission, not blood, magical inheritance, through 1,000 years of teacher-student transmission that kept all 4 lineages intact and convergent. Helga Hufflepuff designed the recognition protocol specifically to find this. She designed it to be patient, because she understood it might take 1,000 years. He paused. It did. The chamber sat with this. Harry gave it time. What this means practically, he said, is that I have a functional relationship with Hogwarts Castle's ward structure that no one has had in over 1,000 years. I can read the wards, maintain them from within, and use them actively in my own defense. This week, I identified and repaired a targeted attack on the castle's own protective enchantments, an attack that was using the Philosopher's Stone's power output to incrementally damage the ward responsible for protecting the castle's heir from institutional coercion. He looked directly at Fudge. The attack was being run by Voldemort. The name dropped into the chamber like a stone into deep water. Ripples went outward, several members flinched visibly, one stood up briefly and sat back down. Fudge went from slightly red to no color at all. Through a host, Harry continued, level and clear. A Hogwarts professor who was removed from the school yesterday morning by Professor Dumbledore. The stone has been moved to a secure location. The ward damage has been repaired. The immediate threat is addressed. He looked around the chamber. I'm telling you this not because I was required to, but because you are the magical government of Britain and you have a right to know that Voldemort has made his first move, that his current state is severely limited but functional, and that the situation requires your attention. Silence. Then the sharp-eyed woman near the top tier said, he's not gone, then. He's been coming back. Yes, Harry said. And you addressed it, she said. An 11-year-old addressed it. I had the right tools, Harry said. Which brings me to what I think should happen instead of what this session was convened to do. He looked at Ogden, who had been watching with the focused attention of a man who has spent 30 years assessing testimony and has just encountered testimony that has reorganized his assessment framework. I'm not interested in the ministry's authority over my magic, Harry said. The castle's own wards include a specific protection against exactly that, and I'm not going to waive it because it's inconvenient for you. But I am interested in cooperation. If Voldemort is moving, and he is, this week has demonstrated that clearly, then the ministry and Hogwarts and I need to be working toward the same objective. He paused. Which means the ministry stops trying to examine, assess, and manage me, and starts treating me as someone with relevant information and capability who is choosing to share it. In exchange, I will keep you informed. Not everything, I'm 11 and I'm entitled to a private magical life, but the parts that affect the broader community. Like tonight. Fudge opened his mouth. Minister, Dumbledore said, from beside Harry. His voice was quiet but it had a quality that made every head in the chamber turn. I believe Mr. Potter's proposal is both reasonable and remarkably generous, given the circumstances. He looked at Fudge steadily. He has just told you more about the current state of Voldemort's return than my own intelligence gathering has produced in 2 months. He has identified a threat, repaired the damage, and brought you the information openly, of his own choice, in a chamber where you were attempting to coerce him. A pause. I suggest we accept the terms. Fudge was looking at Harry in the way people look at things they cannot find a category for. He was not a stupid man. Harry had revised his opinion on this over the week, because stupid men don't navigate ministry politics for 20 years. He was a frightened one, which was different, and the fear in him was now in direct conflict with the pragmatic understanding that the 11-year-old standing in the center of his chamber had just handed him exactly what he needed and was asking very little in return. The diagnostic examination, Umbridge said. Not loud. Precise. She was looking at Harry with an expression that had shed the smile entirely and was simply, nakedly calculating. Withdrawn, she said, making it a decision before Fudge could make it for her, because withdrawing it herself preserved more of her position than having it withdrawn for her. In light of the voluntary disclosure. Harry looked at her. She looked back at him, and they understood each other, clearly and without warmth, in the way of two people who have recognized the shape of the opposition and are deciding whether it's worth the ongoing energy. Thank you, Harry said, and meant neither gratitude nor sarcasm. Just acknowledgement. Ogden called the vote. The session was adjourned without the examination order. 12 members voted against adjournment, which Harry noted, because 12 people in this room had wanted the coercive route badly enough to vote for it even after everything he'd said. He filed their faces carefully. Walking out through the ministry atrium, the golden fountain of magical brethren catching the enchanted light above a floor of black marble, Dumbledore walked beside him and said nothing for a long moment. The atrium was busy with ministry workers on lunch break, and people paused as Harry passed, the ward light visible even through his robes, recognizable now to anyone who'd been paying attention to the news. You could have let me handle the political part, Dumbledore said finally. I know, Harry said. You chose not to. I needed them to see me, Harry said. Not a ward on a piece of legislation. Not a symbol. Not a plan. Me. He looked up at the atrium's ceiling. They can't make good decisions about the situation if they're making them about the wrong thing. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. You are going to change everything, he said, and there was something in his voice that was not certainty, it was something more honest than certainty. Hope. The kind that isn't confident but is paying very close attention. Not just the immediate situation. The way the magical world organizes itself around power and protection and youth. Maybe, Harry said. I just want Hogwarts to be safe and to understand what I'm carrying. Everything else follows from that. Everything else follows from that, Dumbledore said, and he smiled, and this time the smile was entirely real. Not the warm public face. Not the careful calculation. Something older and simpler than both. A man who had spent decades moving pieces on a board and had just watched one of the pieces stand up and start playing. Back at Hogwarts, evening fell over the castle with the particular quality it had developed since the sorting, warmer in its quality of light, more settled in its deep structural thrum, the ward system running at its full sustainable baseline for the first time in 1,000 years. Harry came through the front doors and felt the castle receive him the way it always did now, the warm comprehensive recognition, the 1,000-year patience finally resolved into something present and ongoing. He went to the memory room first. It was quiet. The tablets were glowing at their steady sustained brightness, not the active pulsing of recent days but something more continuous, more settled. He walked to the newest tablet, the one that had been made the night of his sorting, the castle's record of its own decision, and he put one hand against it, lightly. The tablet pulsed once. Not new information. An acknowledgement. The castle had been watching, from its foundational awareness, everything that had happened in the weeks since it had made its choice, and the acknowledgement carried within it the quality of a judgment. This was right, this was what the choice had been for, this was the correct unfolding of a very long plan. Harry stood there for a moment in the quiet gold light and felt the 56 wards on his skin breathe in the same rhythm as the walls around him, the same rhythm as the deep structural heartbeat of the building's foundations, and he understood something he hadn't had words for until now. He was not Hogwarts ward. He was not Hogwarts heir, in the possessive sense, not the castle's, not the founder's, not anyone's property or project or piece on a board. What he was simpler and larger than any of those categories. He was the place where 1,000 years of accumulated magical wisdom had converged into a living person, not through blood or lineage or destiny, but through the continuous human act of one person teaching another, one generation handing something real and true to the next, across hundreds of years and thousands of people, until all four of those lines reached a boy in a cupboard under the stairs and found that the sum of what had been passed down was ready to wake up. He was what Hogwarts was for. Not the sorting or the houses or the curriculum or the institutional machinery. The actual purpose, the reason Gryffindor and Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff and even Slytherin, who had been afraid and had been wrong in his fear but had built something true anyway, had come together to make a place where magic could be taught and passed forward. This. A person in full possession of their own magic, standing in the castle that had grown it, understanding what they carried and choosing how to use it. He took his hand from the tablet. He walked out of the memory room and the door dissolved back into stone behind him, and he went down to the great hall for dinner. Hermione and Neville were already at the table. Hermione looked up when he sat down and assessed him in the way she developed over 2 weeks, quick, comprehensive, accurate. "All right," she said. "Yes," he said. "The Ministry?" "They'll cooperate," he said. "Not perfectly, not always, and those 12 votes will turn up again in some other form. But they'll cooperate." "And Voldemort?" she said, quietly. "Coming back," he said. Slowly. "The stone's gone now, so this particular approach won't work. He'll find another." He reached for the bread. "We'll be ready." She looked at him for a moment and then nodded, once, the nod of someone who has evaluated a situation and found the assessment credible. Neville passed him the butter without being asked, which was a small thing and exactly right. Ron arrived with the specific velocity of someone who has just finished Quidditch practice and has strong feelings about dinner, dropped into the seat across from Harry, looked at his face, and said, "Good day or weird day?" "Both," Harry said. "That's been the theme, hasn't it?" Ron said, and loaded his plate with an admirable quantity of roast potatoes. The great hall filled up around them, all 4 tables, all 4 houses, 800 students at the beginning of their year at this extraordinary, ancient, living building. The enchanted ceiling had cleared to a full autumn night sky, stars dense and brilliant above them, the kind of sky that required no embellishment because it was already everything. The candles burned steady. The ward light on Harry's arms, visible to anyone who looked, was warm and unhurried in the candlelight. McGonagall walked past the Gryffindor table on the way to the head table and paused behind Harry for just a moment. She didn't say anything. She put her hand briefly on his shoulder, not the Dumbledore gesture, performed and warm, but something quick and honest and entirely her own, and walked on. Harry looked at the night sky above the great hall and thought about the memory in the pensive, Slytherin in his cold room, at the end of things, riding by firelight and thinking about fear and choosing in what you leave behind when you're done. He thought about Helga Hufflepuff threading her loyalty anchors and earth magics and the patient conviction that the right person would come, eventually, even if she didn't live to see it. He thought about Ravenclaw's knowledge seals, those extraordinary gifts of intent, the idea that real understanding could be given to someone who was ready to receive it. He thought about Gryffindor's battle magics and courage bindings, the acknowledgement that sometimes the world requires you to stand in a doorway and hold it. He thought about his mother, whose love had been not accidental but the precise activation of a Gryffindor inheritance she hadn't known she was carrying, at the moment it was most needed. He thought about all of it and felt its weight, not as a burden, but as the honest weight of something real, the way the stone floor under the table was real, the way the castles thrown through the flagstones was real. Present. Substantial. His. He was 11 years old. He had a great deal of work to do. He had a war coming toward him at the pace of a man who was rebuilding himself from fragments, and he had a ministry that would cooperate unevenly, and he had a headmaster who was learning, genuinely, painfully, visibly learning, the difference between guardianship and management. He had a castle that was 1,000 years old and knew him better than anyone alive. He had Hermione, who would out-research the entire wizarding world if the situation required it and would do it before breakfast. He had Neville, who had been quiet for so long that when he finally spoke, people listened. He had Ron, who was currently telling Hermione that the ministry sounded like a disaster and asking if there were roast potatoes on her side of the table, and whose simple and uncomplicated friendship was, Harry thought, one of the most underrated forms of power available to a person. He had 56 ward patterns woven into his skin by 1,000 years of accumulated human wisdom and the deliberate, patient, loving design of a woman who had understood that the most important thing she could leave the world was not a monument but a possibility. He raised his goblet. He didn't say anything. Hermione glanced at him, read the gesture, and raised hers. Neville raised his. Ron, confused but willing, raised his. They drank. Outside, the wind came off the Black Lake and moved through the grounds with the particular quality of Scottish autumn, clean and cold and honest, the kind of wind that has been traveling a long distance and arrived exactly where it intended. Inside, the candles burned steady. The castle breathed. Harry Potter set down his goblet and reached for the bread, and the ward light on his hands was warm in the candlelight, all 56 patterns present and even and unhurried, and the 1,000-year-old bones of Hogwarts settled into their night configuration around him like a building that has finally, after a very long wait, come to rest.